The emergence of nymphs in Greek cosmological tradition represents one of the most ancient and fundamental aspects of divine creation, tracing their origins to the very foundations of the universe itself. Unlike many later mythological beings whose births were recorded through specific narratives of divine unions, nymphs arose from the primordial forces that shaped the cosmos, embodying the essential connection between divine power and the natural world that would define Greek religious thought for millennia. According to the earliest cosmogonic accounts, particularly those preserved in Hesiod's Theogony and fragments of other archaic poets, nymphs emerged directly from Gaia, the primordial earth goddess who represented the fundamental creative force of existence. This emergence was not a single event, but rather an ongoing process of divine generation that accompanied the formation of the world's geographic features. As mountains rose from Gaia's body, as rivers carved their channels, and as forests spread across the landscape, nymphs manifested as the divine essence inhabiting these natural formations. This process established them as fundamentally different from the anthropomorphic deities of a later Greek religion, as their very existence was inextricably linked to specific locations and natural phenomena. The genealogical traditions surrounding nymphs reveal a complex web of divine parentage that extends far beyond the commonly cited Zeus-centered narratives of classical mythology. Many nymphs traced their lineage to the Titans, those primordial deities who ruled before the Olympian gods. Oceanus, the great river that encircled the world, fathered the Oceanids, a vast collection of sea nymphs numbering in the thousands, according to various ancient sources. These daughters of Oceanus represented not only bodies of water, but also the life-giving properties of moisture itself, serving as divine guardians of springs, streams, and the underground waters that sustained all terrestrial life. Similarly, the mountain nymphs known as Oreads emerged from unions between various titans and primordial forces, though their exact parentage varied significantly across different regional traditions. Some accounts attributed their creation to Gaia herself, while others described them as daughters of specific mountain gods or regional deities whose names have largely been lost to historical record. This variation in genealogical accounts reflects the deeply localized nature of nymph worship throughout the Greek world, where individual communities maintained their own traditions regarding the divine beings who inhabited their particular landscapes. The relationship between nymphs and the concept of divine animism reveals one of the most sophisticated aspects of early Greek religious thought. Unlike modern conceptions of nature spirits as separate entities inhabiting natural locations, nymphs represented the divine consciousness inherent in the landscape itself. A naiad was not merely a spirit dwelling in a spring. She was the spring's divine essence made manifest, the conscious force that governed its flow, purity, and life-giving properties. This understanding positioned nymphs as intermediary beings whose existence bridged the gap between the transcendent realm of the gods and the material world experienced by mortals. The distinction between immortal and mortal nymphs emerged from these varying modes of divine generation. Those nymphs who sprang directly from primordial deities or major titans possessed true immortality, their existence tied to permanent features of the cosmic order. The Oceanids, for instance, shared in their father's eternal nature, as did many of the Oreads associated with the great mountain ranges that formed the backbone of the Greek landscape. These immortal nymphs functioned as stable points of divine presence in a world otherwise subject to constant change and flux. Conversely, many nymphs possessed what scholars term conditional immortality, their lifespans tied to the natural features they embodied. Tree nymphs or dryads lived only as long as their associated trees, while certain river nymphs might fade if their waterways dried up or changed course. This mortality among some nymphs reflected the Greek understanding of nature as both eternal in its essential patterns and mutable in its specific manifestations. The death of a tree nymph when her oak was felled served as a powerful reminder of the sacred nature of the natural world and the consequences of disrupting the divine order embedded within it. The process by which nymphs emerged from natural phenomena demonstrates the sophisticated theological thinking that characterized early Greek cosmology. Rather than requiring direct divine intervention for each individual creation, the primordial forces established self-generating principles that continue to produce new nymphs as the world developed. When a new spring emerged from underground sources, it naturally manifested its own naiad. When volcanic activity created new islands, Nereids arose to govern the surrounding waters. This ongoing generation of nymphs reflected the dynamic nature of divine creation, suggesting that the cosmos remained actively creative rather than fixed in its initial state. Hesiod's Theogony provides the most systematic early account of nymph origins, positioning them within a carefully structured divine hierarchy. The text describes how various classes of nymphs arose at different stages of cosmic development, with the earliest emerging alongside the fundamental forces of earth, sea, and sky. The Oceanids appear in Hesiod's account as among the first divine beings to emerge after the initial cosmic separation, highlighting their fundamental importance to the structure of the universe. The poet's enumeration of specific Oceanids by name, while incomplete, demonstrates the recognition of individual nymphs as distinct divine personalities rather than mere manifestations of natural forces. The nurturing function of nymphs within the divine hierarchy established them as essential mediators between the creative power of the primordial deities and the needs of both gods and mortals. Many accounts describe nymphs serving as nurses to infant gods, providing the care and protection necessary for divine children to reach maturity. The nymphs of Mount Ida played crucial roles in the upbringing of Zeus himself, while others served similar functions for various regional deities throughout the Greek world. This nurturing aspect extended beyond divine children to encompass the care of heroic mortals and the maintenance of the natural systems that supported all life. The geographic distribution of nymph origins reflects the diverse landscape of the Greek world and the localized nature of early religious practice. Island communities developed rich traditions surrounding the Nereids and other sea nymphs, while mountain regions focused on the Oreads who governed their peaks and valleys. River valleys produced elaborate mythologies surrounding their local Naiads, often incorporating historical memories of settlement patterns and agricultural development. These regional variations in nymph traditions provided a framework for understanding local environmental conditions within the broader context of Greek cosmological thought. The temporal aspects of nymph origins reveal important insights into Greek conceptions of divine time and cosmic development. Unlike the Olympian gods, whose births occurred at specific moments in mythological history, nymphs emerged through processes that continued throughout cosmic time. New nymphs could arise whenever natural conditions produced new geographic features, while existing nymphs might transform or relocate in response to environmental changes. This temporal flexibility allowed nymph traditions to adapt to changing historical circumstances while maintaining their essential connection to the natural world. The relationship between nymphs and the broader category of divine beings known as daimons positioned them within a sophisticated theological framework that recognized multiple levels of divine existence. While the great gods operated on a cosmic scale, governing fundamental forces and abstract principles, nymphs functioned as localized manifestations of divine power, making the sacred immediately accessible to human experience. This accessibility did not diminish their divine status, but rather emphasized their role as active intermediaries who could respond directly to human needs and concerns. The emergence of nymphs from primordial sources established precedents for understanding divine generation that would influence Greek theological thought for centuries. The principle that divine beings could arise spontaneously from appropriate cosmic conditions provided a model for explaining the continued presence of the sacred in the natural world. This understanding supported the development of practices such as the recognition of new cult sites, the establishment of sacred groves, and the identification of previously unknown divine presences in the landscape. The systematic classification of nymphs within Greek mythology reflects a sophisticated understanding of natural hierarchies that mirrored the ancient Greek perception of cosmic order. This taxonomic structure, developed over centuries of religious practice and mythological refinement, established clear distinctions between different types of nymphs based on their domains, powers, and divine genealogies. The classification system served not merely as an organizational tool, but as a fundamental framework for understanding how divine forces operated within the natural world. The Naiads represented the most widespread and numerous category of freshwater nymphs, inhabiting every spring, stream, brook, and river throughout the Greek world. These divine beings possessed intimate knowledge of their aquatic domains, controlling water flow, purity, and the life-sustaining properties essential for human survival. Ancient sources describe Naiads as having the ability to heal through their waters, cure diseases, and provide prophetic insights to those who approach their springs with proper reverence. Their appearance typically reflected the characteristics of their particular water sources. Those dwelling in mountain streams possessed a crystalline clarity and coolness, while river naiads embodied the flowing, dynamic nature of their larger waterways. The powers of individual naiads varied considerably based on the significance and characteristics of their aquatic homes. Major river naiads, such as those associated with the Achilles or Alpheus rivers, wielded substantial influence over regional agriculture and trade, as these waterways served as crucial arteries for ancient Greek civilization. These powerful naiads could alter river courses, control flooding patterns, and influence the fertility of surrounding lands. Lesser naiads governing small springs or seasonal streams possessed more localized abilities but remained equally important to their immediate communities, often serving as the primary source of clean water and spiritual guidance for rural settlements. The Oceanids constituted the most ancient and prestigious category of sea nymphs, tracing their lineage directly to Oceanus, the primordial river that encircled the earth. These 3,000 daughters of Oceanus and Thetis governed not only the world's oceans, but also clouds, rain, and the fundamental moisture that sustained all terrestrial life. The Oceanids operated on a cosmic scale, their influence extending far beyond their aquatic domains to encompass weather patterns, seasonal cycles, and the distribution of life-giving water across the inhabited world. Individual Oceanids possessed distinct personalities and specialized functions within the broader oceanic realm. Metis, perhaps the most famous Oceanid, embodied divine wisdom and cunning intelligence, serving as Zeus's first consort before being swallowed to prevent the prophecy of her bearing a son greater than his father. Styx, the Oceanid of the underworld river bearing her name, commanded such respect among the gods that oaths sworn by her waters became absolutely binding even for Zeus himself. Doris, mother of the 50 Nereids, represented the calm, nurturing aspects of the sea, while others, like Electra, embodied the sea's electrical storms and tempestuous nature. The Oreads claimed dominion over mountains, hills, and elevated terrain throughout the Greek landscape. These mountain nymphs possessed remarkable physical strength and endurance, reflecting the rugged nature of their domains. Ancient accounts describe Oreads as skilled hunters and companions to Artemis, capable of traversing steep cliffs and navigating treacherous mountain paths with supernatural grace. Their knowledge of mountain ecology made them invaluable allies to shepherds, hunters, and travellers who ventured into elevated regions. Different mountain ranges produced Oreads with distinct characteristics and abilities. Those dwelling on Mount Olympus possessed greater divine authority due to their proximity to the god's primary residence, while Oreads of remote peaks developed more solitary and mysterious natures. The nymphs of volcanic mountains like Mount Etna displayed fierce temperaments and connections to underground fires, sometimes serving as intermediaries between surface dwellers and chthonic deities. Alpine Oreads governed snow-covered peaks and glacial valleys, controlling avalanches and seasonal snowmelt that affected water supplies in surrounding lowlands. Dryads and Hamadryads represented the most complex category of tree nymphs, with crucial distinctions determining their longevity and powers. Dryads possessed the ability to move between different trees within their forest domains, making them effectively immortal as long as suitable trees remained available. These mobile tree nymphs served as guardians of entire forest ecosystems, protecting woodland creatures and maintaining the delicate balance between different plant species. Hamadryads, conversely, bound their life force to specific individual trees, sharing the mortality of their chosen hosts while gaining intimate knowledge of their particular species. The relationship between Hamadryads and their trees created some of the most poignant stories in Greek mythology, as the death of an ancient oak or sacred olive tree meant the simultaneous death of its associated nymph. This connection made Hamadryads fierce protectors of their individual trees, capable of cursing those who threatened their hosts with disease, madness, or death. Sacred groves throughout Greece housed communities of both Dryads and Hamadryads, creating sanctuaries where human interference was strictly forbidden under penalty of divine retribution. The Nereids occupied a specialized position among sea nymphs as the 50 daughters of the sea god Nereus and the Oceanid Doris. Unlike their Oceanid mother and aunts, who governed vast oceanic realms, Nereids focused their attention on coastal waters, harbours, and the interface between land and sea. These nymphs possessed detailed knowledge of tides, currents, and marine life, making them essential allies for sailors, fishermen, and coastal communities. Ancient sources consistently portrayed Nereids as benevolent beings who rescued drowning sailors, guided ships through dangerous waters, and provided warnings about approaching storms. Individual Nereids developed reputations for specific maritime skills and characteristics. Amphitrite, who became Poseidon's consort, represented the sea's regal and majestic aspects, while Thetis gained fame for her prophetic abilities and role as Achilles' mother. Galatea embodied the sea's playful and beautiful nature, inspiring numerous artistic representations throughout antiquity. The collective presence of all 50 Nereids could calm the most violent storms or, when angered, generate devastating tempests that destroyed entire fleets. Among the lesser-known but equally significant classifications, the Antausai governed flowers, blossoms, and the reproductive cycles of flowering plants. These delicate nymphs possessed the ability to control pollination, seed dispersal, and the timing of seasonal blooms that determined agricultural success throughout the ancient world. Individual Antausai specialized in particular flower species, developing deep expertise in their chosen plants' medicinal properties, symbolic meanings, and roles within larger ecological systems. The Rose Antausai commanded particular respect due to their association with Aphrodite, while those governing grain flowers held crucial importance for agricultural communities. The Lampes represented one of the most mysterious nymph categories, serving as torch-bearing attendants to Hecate in her role as goddess of magic, crossroads, and the underworld. These underworld nymphs possessed knowledge of necromancy, herbal magic, and the secret pathways connecting the realm of the living with the domain of the dead. Ancient magical papyri reference Lampades as intermediaries who could facilitate communication with deceased spirits and provide access to forbidden knowledge. Their torches burned with supernatural flames that revealed hidden truths and illuminated the darkest corners of both physical and metaphysical realms. The Hesperides, daughters of Atlas or Erebus depending on the source, guarded the golden apples that granted immortality in the garden, located at the world's western edge. These evening nymphs possessed authority over sunset, twilight, and the transition from day to night. Their garden represented a liminal space where the normal rules of mortality and time operated differently, making them crucial figures in heroic quests seeking immortality or divine favour. The 3 or 4 Hesperides worked in perfect coordination to maintain their sacred grove, using their combined powers to create an environment where golden apples could grow and ripen. The 7 Pleiades occupied a unique position among star nymphs, their mythological roles connecting terrestrial events with celestial phenomena. As daughters of Atlas and the Oceanid Pleione, these nymphs bridge the gap between earthbound and cosmic divine forces. Their transformation into stars following their deaths or ascension created one of the most recognizable constellations in ancient astronomy, serving as a celestial calendar that marked seasonal changes crucial for agricultural and maritime activities. Individual Pleiades developed distinct mythological narratives. Maia became the mother of Hermes, while Electra bore Dardanus, the founder of Troy. The hierarchical structure within nymph society reflected broader patterns of divine organization that characterized Greek religious thought. At the apex stood ancient Oceanids like Metis and Styx, whose cosmic importance and direct descent from primordial titans granted them authority over lesser nymphs. These senior nymphs possessed the ability to command their juniors, coordinate large-scale natural phenomena, and serve as intermediaries between major gods and lower-ranking divine beings. Their decisions could affect entire regions, influencing weather patterns, water distribution, and the overall health of natural ecosystems. Regional variations in nymph classification reveal the deeply localized nature of Greek religious practice and the influence of geographic factors on mythological development. Island communities developed elaborate hierarchies among their Nereids and sea nymphs, reflecting the crucial importance of maritime activities for their survival and prosperity. Mountainous regions created complex relationships between different types of Oreads, with elevation determining relative status and authority. River valleys established intricate networks of Naiad relationships that mirrored the branching patterns of their waterway systems. The Aegean islands produced particularly sophisticated Nereid mythologies, with individual islands claiming patronage by specific sea nymphs who governed their coastal waters and influenced their maritime fortunes. Delos, sacred to Apollo and Artemis, maintained traditions regarding the Nereids who assisted Leto during the divine twins' birth, while Crete developed elaborate stories about the nymphs who nursed the infant Zeus in hidden caves. These island traditions often incorporated historical memories of settlement patterns, trade relationships, and natural disasters into their nymph mythologies. Continental Greek regions adapted nymph classifications to reflect their diverse landscapes and economic activities. The fertile plains of Thessaly produced rich traditions surrounding river Naiads, who controlled irrigation and seasonal flooding, while the mountainous terrain of Arcadia fostered elaborate Oread mythologies that incorporated pastoral activities and wilderness survival. The forested regions of northern Greece developed sophisticated Dryad hierarchies that reflected different tree species and forest types, with oak Dryads generally holding higher status than those associated with less prestigious trees. Colonial settlements throughout the Mediterranean carried Greek nymph traditions to new environments, adapting existing classifications to incorporate local geographic features and environmental conditions. Sicily's volcanic landscape produced unique variations on Oread mythology that incorporated connections to underground fires and seismic activity. The Black Sea colonies developed specialized Naiad traditions adapted to their region's harsh winters and seasonal ice formation. These colonial adaptations demonstrated the flexibility of Greek nymph classification systems and their ability to incorporate new environmental realities while maintaining essential theological principles. The genealogical foundation of the Oceanids represents one of the most significant divine lineages in Greek mythology, establishing these sea nymphs as the eldest and most powerful class of nymphs through their direct descent from the primordial titans Oceanus and Thetis. Ancient sources, particularly Hesiod's Theogony, describe the birth of 3,000 Oceanids, a number that signified their vast multitude rather than a precise count. This enormous divine family emerged from the union of Oceanus, the great river that encircled the earth, and Thetis, the primordial sea goddess who embodied the feminine principle of oceanic fertility and nourishment. The birth of the Oceanids occurred during the earliest phase of cosmic development, when the Titans ruled before the rise of the Olympian gods. Oceanus himself represented the fundamental waters that surrounded and supported the entire world, his body forming the boundary between the known cosmos and the mysterious regions beyond. Thetis complemented her consort by governing the internal waters of the earth, the underground streams, springs, and aquifers that fed all terrestrial water sources. Their union produced daughters who inherited both parents' dominion over water in all its forms, from the vast oceans to the smallest mountain springs. The 3,000 Oceanids divided among themselves the governance of every water body known to the ancient Greeks. Each major sea, significant river, important spring, and even rain clouds and morning dew fell under the protection of specific Oceanids. This distribution of authority created a comprehensive divine bureaucracy that managed the world's hydrological cycle with systematic precision. The eldest Oceanids claimed dominion over the most significant water bodies, the Mediterranean Sea, the Black Sea, and the great rivers that form the boundaries of the civilized world. Younger sisters governed smaller but equally vital water sources that sustained local communities and regional ecosystems. The hierarchical structure among the Oceanids reflected both their order of birth and the relative importance of their aquatic domains. Senior Oceanids possessed authority over their younger sisters, coordinating large-scale weather patterns and seasonal changes that required cooperation between multiple water sources. During the annual flood cycles that characterized many ancient rivers, teams of Oceanids worked together to ensure proper timing and distribution of floodwaters that fertilized agricultural lands without causing destructive overflow. This collaborative approach distinguished the Oceanids from other nymph categories, whose members typically operated independently within their individual domains. Meti occupied the most prominent position among the Oceanids, her name meaning cunning intelligence or wise counsel in ancient Greek. Unlike her sisters who focused primarily on aquatic governance, Meti embodied the intellectual aspects of divine wisdom, making her an invaluable advisor to the emerging generation of Olympian gods. Her marriage to Zeus represented a crucial alliance between the old Titanic order and the new Olympian regime, temporarily bridging the generational divide that characterized early Greek cosmology. Zeus's decision to swallow Meti while she was pregnant reflected his fear of the prophecy, stating that her son would surpass his father in power, demonstrating the respect even the king of the gods held for Oceanid wisdom. The absorption of Meti into Zeus's being had profound consequences for both divine politics and the nature of wisdom itself. Ancient sources describe how Meti continued to exist within Zeus, providing him with the strategic intelligence that enabled his victories over the Titans and his successful establishment of Olympian rule. This internalization of Oceanid wisdom transformed Zeus from a powerful but potentially reckless young god into a calculating ruler capable of long-term planning and complex political maneuvering. The birth of Athena from Zeus's head represented the external manifestation of Meti's continued influence, as the goddess of wisdom inherited her mother's intellectual gifts while serving her father's interests. Styx commanded perhaps the most feared and respected position among all Oceanids through her governance of the underworld river that bore her name. The river Styx served as the primary boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, making its divine guardian a crucial figure in both mortal and immortal affairs. Ancient Greeks believed that the waters of Styx possessed unique properties that made oaths sworn upon them absolutely binding even for the gods themselves. This power derived from Styx's role as the first deity to support Zeus during his war against the Titans, earning her special privileges that elevated her above her sisters in terms of divine authority. The binding power of Styx's oaths created a fundamental mechanism for maintaining order within the divine hierarchy. When gods swore by the river Styx, they subjected themselves to severe penalties for perjury, including temporary loss of their divine powers and exile from Olympus. This system prevented the chaos that might otherwise result from divine deception and established clear consequences for breaking sacred promises. Styx's enforcement of these oaths required her to maintain constant vigilance over divine behaviour, making her both a trusted ally and a feared enforcer among the Olympian gods. Doris represented the nurturing and maternal aspects of oceanic divinity through her role as mother to the 50 Nereids. Her marriage to Nereus, the old man of the sea, produced daughters who inherited the best qualities of both parents. Nereus's prophetic abilities and knowledge of sea creatures, combined with Doris's Oceanid mastery over oceanic currents and weather patterns. This union between an Oceanid and a sea god created a new generation of marine nymphs who possessed enhanced powers and closer connections to human affairs than their purely titanic ancestors. The 50 Nereids born to Doris became renowned throughout the ancient world for their beauty, wisdom, and benevolent treatment of sailors and coastal communities. Unlike some divine beings who remained aloof from mortal concerns, the Nereids actively intervened to rescue drowning sailors, guide ships through dangerous waters, and provide warnings about approaching storms. This protective behaviour reflected their mother Doris's influence, as she had instilled in her daughters a sense of responsibility for the welfare of those who depended upon the sea for their livelihood. Eurynome occupied a unique position among the Oceanids through her role as mother to the 3 Graces, who embodied divine beauty, charm, and artistic inspiration. Her union with Zeus produced daughters who became essential attendants to Aphrodite and crucial figures in the development of human culture and civilization. The Graces governed not only physical beauty, but also the social graces that enabled harmonious relationships between individuals and communities. Through her daughters, Eurynome influenced human society in ways that extended far beyond her original oceanic domain. The birth of the Graces from an Oceanid mother established important connections between water symbolism and concepts of beauty and fertility in Greek culture. Ancient artists frequently depicted the Graces near springs or fountains, emphasizing their connection to the life-giving properties of fresh water. This association reflected broader Greek beliefs about the relationship between water purity and physical beauty, as clean water was essential for health and attractiveness. Eurynome's maternal influence ensured that her daughters maintained these connections to their aquatic heritage while developing their specialized roles in human affairs. The Oceanids' function as mothers of rivers, springs, and other water bodies established the mythological geography that ancient Greeks used to understand their physical world. Each major river system traced its divine parentage to specific Oceanids who had mated with river gods or other aquatic deities. The Achilles River, considered the greatest river in Greece, claimed descent from the Oceanid Melpomene, while the Alpheus River traced its lineage to the union of an Oceanid with a regional water deity. These genealogical connections provided explanations for the characteristics of different water bodies. Swift mountain streams inherited the energetic nature of their Oceanid mothers, while broad, slow rivers reflected more contemplative maternal influences. The establishment of mythological geography through Oceanid genealogies served practical purposes beyond mere storytelling. Ancient Greek colonists used these divine lineages to justify their claims to new territories, arguing that their settlements honoured the Oceanids who governed local water sources. When Greek cities established colonies throughout the Mediterranean, they often identified local springs and rivers with specific Oceanids, creating religious continuity between homeland and colonial territories. This practice helped maintain cultural cohesion across the expanding Greek world, while providing divine sanction for territorial expansion. Regional variations in Oceanid worship reflected the diverse needs and characteristics of different Greek communities. Coastal cities naturally emphasized those Oceanids who governed sea currents and harbour waters. developing elaborate festivals and rituals designed to ensure safe navigation and profitable maritime trade. Island communities created particularly complex mythologies surrounding their patron Oceanids, often incorporating local geographic features into elaborate foundation stories that explain the origins of their settlements and the divine protection they enjoyed. Agricultural communities focused their attention on Oceanids, who controlled the springs and streams that fed their irrigation systems. These inland settlements developed sophisticated calendrical systems based on the seasonal activities of their local Oceanids, timing planting and harvesting to coincide with periods when particular water nymphs were believed to be most active and benevolent. The success of these agricultural communities depended heavily on maintaining proper relationships with their Oceanid protectors through regular offerings, festivals, and the preservation of sacred groves near important water sources. The political significance of Oceanids extended beyond local religious practice to influence interstate relations and territorial disputes throughout the Greek world. Cities that shared water sources often developed complex diplomatic protocols based on their respective relationships with the Oceanids who governed those waters. Treaties between neighbouring communities frequently included provisions for joint festivals honouring shared Oceanid protectors, creating religious obligations that helped maintain peace and cooperation. Violations of these religious agreements were considered serious offences that could provoke divine retribution against entire communities. The cult worship of individual Oceanids varied significantly based on their specific roles and regional importance. Meti received honours primarily from philosophers, political advisors, and others who sought divine wisdom in their professional activities. Her worship involved offerings of honey, olive oil, and written petitions requesting guidance in complex decision-making situations. Temples dedicated to Meti typically featured libraries or spaces for contemplation, reflecting her association with intellectual pursuits and strategic planning. Styx commanded a different type of reverence, her worship characterized by solemn oaths and binding ceremonies rather than joyful festivals. Ancient Greeks approached Styx's cult sites with careful preparation and serious intent, understanding that frivolous or false oaths could result in severe divine punishment. Her temples maintained pools of specially consecrated water used for oath-taking ceremonies, and priests trained in the proper formulas and procedures required for different types of sacred promises. Political leaders, military commanders, and merchants regularly visited Styx's shrines to formalize important agreements and ensure divine enforcement of their commitments. The fundamental distinction between Naiads and Nereids represents one of the most important taxonomical divisions within the broader category of water nymphs, reflecting not merely different aquatic domains, but entirely separate divine lineages, powers, and relationships with both mortals and gods. Naiads governed the freshwater systems that sustained terrestrial life. Every spring, brook, stream, river, lake, and underground aquifer throughout the Greek world fell under their protection. These freshwater nymphs possessed intimate knowledge of their particular water sources, controlling flow rates, seasonal variations, and the mineral properties that determined each water body's unique characteristics and beneficial qualities. The Nereids, by contrast, represented a distinct divine family consisting of exactly 50 daughters born to the sea god Nereus and the Oceanid Doris. Unlike the countless Naiads who emerged from various divine unions and primordial generation, the Nereids formed a cohesive sisterhood with clearly defined genealogy and collective identity. Their domain encompassed the Mediterranean Sea and its coastal waters, where they governed tides, currents, marine life, and the complex interactions between salt water and the terrestrial environment. This specialization in marine environments gave the Nereids different powers and concerns compared to their freshwater counterparts. The prophetic abilities of Naiads reached their highest expression at sacred oracle sites throughout the Greek world, where specific springs served as conduits for divine revelation and communication with the gods. The most renowned of these prophetic Naiads dwelt at Delphi. where the sacred Castalian spring provided the pure water essential for the Pythia's oracular pronouncements. The Naiad Castalia, for whom the spring was named, possessed the ability to inspire prophetic visions in those who drank from her waters or bathed in her sacred pools. Ancient accounts describe how pilgrims approaching the Delphic oracle would first purify themselves in Castalia's waters, receiving preliminary visions or insights that prepared them for their consultation with Apollo's priestess. Castalia's prophetic powers derived from her unique position at the intersection of terrestrial and divine realms, where underground waters emerging from deep within the earth carried messages from chthonic deities and the spirits of the dead. The chemical composition of the Castalian spring, rich in minerals and naturally occurring gases that could induce altered states of consciousness, enhanced the Naiads' ability to facilitate communication between mortal supplicants and divine sources of knowledge. Ancient Greek physicians and natural philosophers recognized these physical properties while maintaining that Castalia's divine presence transformed mere geological phenomena into genuine prophetic experiences. The sacred spring at Dodona housed another powerful prophetic naiad, whose waters complemented the famous talking oak tree in Zeus's ancient oracle. This unnamed naiad possessed the ability to interpret the rustling of oak leaves and the flight patterns of sacred doves, translating these natural signs into coherent prophetic messages. Pilgrims to Dodona would drink from the naiad spring before approaching the sacred oak, believing that her waters enhanced their ability to understand the subtle communications transmitted through natural phenomena. The combination of the prophetic spring and the talking oak created one of Greece's most reliable oracular sites, consulted by kings and commoners seeking divine guidance. The island of Delos maintained traditions surrounding the naiad Inopus, whose sacred river provided the pure water necessary for the island's function as Apollo and Artemis's birthplace. Inopus possessed the remarkable ability to rise and fall in sympathy with the Nile River in distant Egypt, demonstrating the mysterious connections between far-separated water sources and their divine guardians. This sympathetic relationship enabled Inopus to provide prophetic insights about events in Egypt and other distant lands, making her spring a valuable source of information for merchants, diplomats, and military commanders planning expeditions to foreign territories. The prophetic naiads of oracle sites developed specialized relationships with the major gods whose messages they transmitted. These divine partnerships required careful maintenance through regular offerings, seasonal festivals, and the preservation of ritual purity around their sacred waters. Pollution of a prophetic spring, whether through physical contamination or ritual violation, could sever the naiad's connection to a divine patron and eliminate the site's oracular powers. Ancient communities invested considerable resources in protecting these sacred water sources, establishing strict regulations governing access and use, while maintaining corps of specialized priests responsible for the spring's care and purification. Individual Nereids achieved prominence through their marriages to gods and their roles in the epic narratives that defined Greek heroic literature. Thetis, perhaps the most famous Nereid, possessed prophetic abilities that rivaled those of the most powerful oracular deities. Her knowledge of fate and future events made her a crucial figure in the Trojan War cycle, as she alone knew that her son Achilles faced the choice between a long, obscure life and a brief existence crowned with eternal glory. Ancient sources describe Thetis's attempts to circumvent fate by hiding Achilles among the daughters of King Lycomedes, demonstrating both her maternal devotion and her understanding of destiny's inexorable nature. The marriage of Thetis to the mortal Peleus resulted from Zeus's fear of a prophecy, stating that the sea nymph would bear a son greater than his father. Rather than risk producing a challenger to his own supremacy, Zeus arranged Thetis's union with a mortal hero, ensuring that her son would possess great power without threatening the Olympian order. The wedding celebration, attended by all the gods except the goddess Eris, became the catalyst for the events leading to the Trojan War, when the uninvited goddess cast the golden apple inscribed to the fairest among the wedding guests. This connection between Thetis's marriage and the greatest conflict in Greek mythology established her as a pivotal figure whose personal choices affected the entire heroic age. Thetis's protective relationship with Achilles extended beyond typical maternal care to include divine intervention in mortal affairs. Ancient accounts describe her repeated attempts to shield her son from harm, providing him with armour forged by Hephaestus, and intervening with Zeus to honour Achilles when Agamemnon dishonoured him. Her ability to move freely between the marine realm and Mount Olympus made her an effective advocate for mortal heroes, though her efforts ultimately could not prevent the fulfilment of fate. The grief of Thetis at Achilles' death, described in both the Iliad and later epic poems, demonstrated the profound emotional bonds that connected Nereids to their mortal descendants and lovers. Amphitrite's elevation to become Poseidon's consort established her as queen of the seas and the most powerful of all marine nymphs. Ancient sources describe how Poseidon first encountered Amphitrite while she danced with her sisters on the island of Naxos, immediately falling in love with her graceful beauty and regal bearing. Amphitrite initially fled from the sea god's advances, hiding in the depths of the ocean until Poseidon's messenger, a dolphin, convinced her to accept his proposal. This courtship established important precedents for relationships between major gods and nymphs, demonstrating that even the most powerful Olympians sought consent rather than simply taking what they desired. As Poseidon's wife, Amphitrite shared authority over all marine life and oceanic phenomena, her influence extending from the deepest abyssal plains to the shallowest tidal pools. Ancient sailors recognized her power over sea conditions, offering prayers and sacrifices to ensure her favor during dangerous voyages. Amphitrite possessed the ability to calm violent storms or, when angered, to generate tempests that could destroy entire fleets. Her relationship with Poseidon was generally harmonious, though ancient sources record instances where she punished mortals who offended her or threatened her divine prerogatives, particularly women who claimed to rival her beauty or challenged her authority over marine affairs. The story of Galatea and the Cyclops Polyphemus represents one of the most poignant tales of unrequited love in Greek mythology, demonstrating the complex relationships that could develop between Nereids and other mythological beings. Galatea, whose name meant milk white, embodied the sea's most beautiful and serene aspects, her appearance described as surpassing even Aphrodite in its pure ethereal loveliness. The Cyclops Polyphemus, son of Poseidon, fell desperately in love with the Nereid despite his monstrous appearance and crude behaviour, composing awkward songs and bringing her gifts of cheese and milk in futile attempts to win her affection. Galatea's rejection of Polyphemus's advances led to tragic consequences when the Cyclops discovered her love affair with the beautiful shepherd Achilles. In a jealous rage, Polyphemus crushed Achilles beneath a massive boulder, transforming the young man into a river that flowed into the sea where Galatea could embrace him eternally. This myth established important themes about the relationship between different types of water. The river Achilles, flowing into Galatea's marine domain, symbolized the eternal connection between freshwater and saltwater systems, while also illustrating the tragic consequences that could result from the intersection of divine and mortal love. The protective nature of water nymphs manifested through their fierce guardianship of their aquatic domains and their willingness to punish those who violated the sacred nature of their waters. Naiads possessed the power to drown mortals who polluted their springs, diverted their streams without permission, or committed acts of violence near their sacred sites. Ancient sources describe numerous instances where individuals who showed disrespect to local naiads found themselves pulled beneath the water's surface. Their bodies never recovered despite extensive searches by their communities. These drownings served as warnings to others about the importance of maintaining proper relationships with the divine forces that controlled essential water sources. The vengeful aspect of Naiad justice extended beyond simple punishment to include sophisticated forms of retribution that matched the nature of specific offences. Individuals who poisoned springs faced death by poisoning, while those who diverted water for selfish purposes found their own wells running dry during crucial seasons. The Naiad Arethusa demonstrated this principle when she transformed herself into an underground stream to escape the river god Alpheus's unwanted pursuit, eventually emerging as a spring on the island of Sicily, where she could maintain her independence while continuing to provide fresh water to the local population. Nereids displayed similar protective instincts regarding their marine territories, though their methods of enforcement differed from those employed by their freshwater counterparts. Rather than drowning offenders, Nereids typically used their control over weather and sea conditions to punish those who violated maritime customs or showed disrespect to the sea's divine nature. Ships that dumped waste in sacred waters might find themselves becalmed for weeks, while captains who refused to honour the Nereids with proper offerings could face sudden storms that drove their vessels onto rocky shores or into dangerous currents. The benevolent aspect of water nymph protection became evident in their relationships with mortals, who showed proper reverence and respect for aquatic environments. Naiads regularly guided lost travellers to fresh water sources, healed injuries with their purifying waters, and provided warnings about dangerous weather conditions that might affect river crossings or mountain travel. Ancient Greek literature contains numerous accounts of heroes and ordinary citizens whose lives were saved through timely intervention by local Naiads who had observed their pious behaviour and charitable treatment of others. The healing powers of Naiads made them particularly valuable allies for communities that maintained proper relationships with their local water nymphs. Specific springs throughout the Greek world gained reputations for curing particular ailments, their therapeutic properties attributed to the benevolent influence of their resident Naiads. The spring of Pyrene at Corinth became famous for healing eye diseases, while certain mountain springs in Arcadia could cure skin conditions and joint pain. These healing waters required careful ritual preparation and appropriate offerings to maintain their effectiveness, as the Naiads would withdraw their beneficial influence if their springs were treated carelessly or used for inappropriate purposes. Nereids extended their protective care to encompass not only individual sailors, but entire maritime communities that honoured their divine authority. Coastal cities that maintained regular festivals celebrating the 50 Sisters often enjoyed unusually favourable weather conditions, abundant fish harvests, and protection from piracy and naval attacks. The island of Aegina developed particularly elaborate ceremonies honouring the Nereids, crediting their divine protection with the island's prosperity as a major maritime trading centre. These community-wide relationships required ongoing maintenance through public sacrifices, temple construction, and the establishment of sacred groves near harbours and beaches. The seasonal activities of water nymphs created annual cycles of divine presence and withdrawal that ancient communities learned to recognise and accommodate. Many Naiads became more active during spring flood seasons, when their waters ran highest and clearest, making this period optimal for seeking their assistance or favour. Conversely, the dry summer months often saw reduced Naiad activity as their water sources diminished, requiring communities to exercise greater caution in their interactions with these temporarily weakened deities. Nereids followed different seasonal patterns tied to maritime weather, becoming most active during the sailing season when their protection was most crucial for commercial and military activities. The distinction between Dryads and Hamadryads represents one of the most crucial taxonomical divisions within the realm of tree nymphs, fundamentally determining not only their powers and longevity, but also their relationship to the forest ecosystems they inhabited. Dryads possessed the remarkable ability to move freely between different trees within their designated woodland territories, their life force remaining independent of any single plant organism. This mobility granted them effective immortality, as the death of individual trees posed no threat to their continued existence. A dryad could abandon a dying oak to inhabit a healthy pine, or migrate seasonally between different groves as environmental conditions changed, maintaining her divine essence across multiple host plants throughout her eternal lifespan. Hamadryads experienced an entirely different form of existence, their life force inextricably bound to specific individual trees through a mystical connection that ancient Greeks understood as sympathetic magic. When a Hamadryad chose her host tree, typically during the plant's early growth phase, she merged her divine essence with the tree's natural life force, creating a symbiotic relationship that enhanced both beings' vitality and longevity. The chosen tree would grow larger, stronger, and more beautiful than its natural counterparts, often living for centuries beyond the normal lifespan of its species. However, this enhanced vitality came at the cost of mutual mortality. The death of the tree meant the immediate death of its Hamadryad, while harm to the nymph would cause corresponding damage to her arboreal host. This fundamental difference in life force attachment created distinct behavioural patterns between the two types of tree nymphs. Dryads developed broader perspectives on forest management, their immortal nature allowing them to observe and influence ecological changes across multiple generations of trees. They understood the complex relationships between different plant species, the soil conditions necessary for optimal growth, and the seasonal cycles that determined forest health. Their mobile nature made them excellent coordinators of forest-wide activities, as they could travel throughout their territories to assess conditions and communicate with other woodland spirits about threats or opportunities requiring collective action. Hamadryads, conversely, developed intensely focused relationships with their individual trees, acquiring intimate knowledge of their host's specific needs, vulnerabilities, and unique characteristics. A Hamadryad bound to an ancient oak understood every aspect of her tree's biology, the optimal timing for acorn production, the specific soil nutrients required for healthy growth, and the precise amount of sunlight needed for photosynthesis. This specialized knowledge made Hamadryads extraordinarily effective guardians of their individual trees, but also created fierce territorial behavior when other beings threatened their host's well-being. The process of sympathetic magic that connected Hamadryads to their trees operated through principles that ancient Greek natural philosophers attempted to understand and categorize. The initial bonding typically occurred when both the nymph and tree were young, creating a gradual merger of life forces that strengthened over time. Ancient sources describe how young Hamadryads would spend months or even years in close proximity to potential host trees, testing the compatibility between their divine essence and the plant's natural energy. Once a suitable match was identified, the bonding process involved complex rituals that permanently linked the two beings' life forces. The sympathetic connection manifested through visible changes in both the Hamadryad and her chosen tree. The nymph's appearance would gradually incorporate characteristics of her host species. An oak Hamadryad might develop bark-like skin texture and acorn-shaped jewellery, while a pine Hamadryad could acquire needle-like hair and resinous tears. The tree itself would display supernatural qualities that distinguished it from ordinary specimens of its species. Sacred oaks bound to Hamadryads grew to enormous sizes with perfectly symmetrical canopies, while pine trees developed unusually straight trunks and branches that formed aesthetically pleasing patterns. The concept of natural spirits as conscious entities inhabiting and governing specific aspects of the physical world represented a sophisticated theological framework that positioned tree nymphs as intermediary beings between the transcendent realm of the gods and the material world experienced by mortals. Unlike the anthropomorphic Olympian deities who possessed clearly defined personalities and operated according to human-like motivations, tree nymphs embodied the inherent consciousness that ancient Greeks perceived within the natural world itself. They were not separate entities dwelling within trees, but rather the awakened awareness of the trees themselves, given divine form and intelligence. This understanding of natural spirits created important implications for human interactions with forest environments. Every tree potentially housed a conscious divine being capable of experiencing pleasure, pain, gratitude, and anger in response to human behavior. Woodcutters who needed to harvest timber for construction or fuel learned to approach trees with appropriate rituals, offering prayers and small sacrifices to appease any resident nymphs before beginning their work. The failure to observe these protocols could result in accidents, tool breakage, or cursed lumber that brought misfortune to construction projects. Sacred groves throughout the ancient Greek world served as protected sanctuaries where tree nymphs could flourish without fear of human interference, their divine inhabitants serving as guardians of these natural temples dedicated to various gods and goddesses. These woodland sanctuaries represented some of the most ancient religious sites in Greek culture, predating the construction of stone temples and formal urban cult centres. The trees themselves functioned as living temples, their canopies providing natural roofs for religious ceremonies, while their trunks served as focal points for offerings and prayers. The sacred grove at Dodona housed Zeus's famous oracular oak, whose rustling leaves provided prophetic messages interpreted by trained priests and priestesses. The Dryads inhabiting this grove possessed enhanced prophetic abilities derived from their proximity to Zeus's divine presence, their whispered communications with the oracle tree enabling them to provide supplementary guidance to pilgrims seeking divine wisdom. Ancient accounts describe how these prophetic Dryads would appear to particularly pious visitors, offering additional insights that clarified or expanded upon the messages received from the speaking oak. The grove's sanctity required constant protection from both natural threats and human interference. The Dryads worked cooperatively to maintain optimal growing conditions for the oracle tree, ensuring adequate water supply during dry seasons, and protecting the sacred oak from lightning strikes, disease, and insect infestations. They also served as guardians against human violations of the grove's sacred nature, using their powers to confuse and disorient individuals who entered the sanctuary with inappropriate intentions or insufficient respect for its divine inhabitants. Dionysus maintained numerous sacred groves throughout Greece, where his followers conducted the secret rituals and ecstatic ceremonies that characterized his mystery religion. The tree nymphs inhabiting these Dionysiac sanctuaries possessed special connections to the god of wine and divine madness, their consciousness altered by his intoxicating presence to facilitate the transcendent experiences sought by his initiates. These altered Dryads and Hamadryads could induce visionary states in human participants, creating the mystical encounters that form the core of Dionysiac religious practice. The grapevines that dominated many Dionysiac groves hosted specialized Hamadryads, whose life forces merged with the wine-producing plants to create supernatural vintages with consciousness-altering properties. These divine wines could produce prophetic visions, facilitate communication with deceased spirits, or generate the ecstatic states necessary for achieving union with Dionysus himself. The Hamadryads carefully regulated the production and distribution of these sacred wines, ensuring that only properly initiated individuals received access to the most potent varieties while protecting uninitiated mortals from substances that could drive them permanently insane. The mystery religions associated with Demeter incorporated tree nymphs as essential participants in the agricultural cycles that governed grain production and seasonal fertility. The sacred groves near Eleusis housed Dryads who possessed intimate knowledge of the connections between tree health and soil fertility, understanding how forest ecosystems influence the productivity of surrounding farmland. These agricultural Dryads worked closely with Demeter's priests to coordinate the seasonal ceremonies that ensured successful harvests, their forest-based perspective providing crucial insights into the ecological relationships that sustained ancient Greek agriculture. The olive groves sacred to Athena throughout Attica maintained communities of Hamadryads whose bonding with olive trees created some of the most productive and long-lived specimens in the ancient world. These olive Hamadryads possess specialized knowledge of olive cultivation, understanding the precise pruning techniques, soil amendments, and harvesting methods that maximize both oil production and tree longevity. Their expertise made them valuable allies for human olive farmers, who would seek their guidance through offerings and prayers at small shrines erected near particularly ancient and productive olive trees. The Hesperides occupied a unique position among tree nymphs as the guardians of the golden apples that granted immortality, their garden located at the western edge of the world where the sun set each evening. Ancient sources provide varying accounts of their exact number and parentage, with some traditions describing 3 sisters while others mention 4 or 7. Their father was typically identified as either Atlas, the titan who held up the sky, or Erebus, the primordial deity of darkness, while their mother was variously described as Nyx Hesperis, or one of several other twilight goddesses. The Garden of the Hesperides represented a liminal space where the normal rules of time and mortality operated differently, existing at the boundary between the world of the living and the mysterious realms beyond the sunset. The golden apple tree that grew at the garden's centre possessed supernatural properties that distinguished it from ordinary fruit trees, its apples containing the essence of immortality that could extend divine life indefinitely or grant eternal youth to worthy mortals. The tree itself was a gift from Gaia to Hera on her wedding day, its divine nature requiring specialized care that only the Hesperides possessed the knowledge and power to provide. The 3 or 4 Hesperides worked in perfect coordination to maintain their sacred garden, each sister contributing specialized skills to the collective effort of tending the immortality tree. Aigla, whose name meant radiance, controlled the garden's lighting conditions, ensuring that the golden apples received the precise amount of sunlight necessary for their supernatural properties to develop properly. Erythea, the red one, managed the soil composition and irrigation systems that nourished the tree's roots, while Hesperia governed the evening breezes that carried away harmful influences and brought beneficial atmospheric conditions to the garden. The dragon Ladon served as the Hesperides' primary guardian, his 100 heads and sleepless vigilance providing protection against unauthorized intruders who might attempt to steal the golden apples. However, the Hesperides themselves possessed formidable defensive abilities, their mastery over twilight phenomena enabling them to create illusions, manipulate shadows, and alter the perception of time within their garden. Intruders who managed to bypass Ladon often found themselves trapped in temporal loops or lost in maze-like illusions that prevented them from locating the apple tree, despite being within the garden's boundaries. The theft of the golden apples by Heracles during his 11th labour required not only overcoming Ladon, but also gaining the cooperation, or at least the passive consent of the Hesperides themselves. Ancient sources describe various strategies employed by the hero, from direct negotiation with the sisters to elaborate deceptions involving Atlas's temporary assumption of Heracles' burden of holding up the sky. The success of this labour demonstrated that even the most carefully guarded divine treasures could be obtained through proper combination of strength, intelligence, and divine favour. The prophetic oak trees at Dodona represented one of the most ancient oracular sites in Greece, their divine communication abilities attributed to the specialized Dryads who inhabited the sacred grove surrounding Zeus's primary oracle. These prophetic Dryads possessed enhanced sensitivity to divine communications, their consciousness attuned to the subtle vibrations and atmospheric changes that preceded oracular pronouncements. They served as interpreters and amplifiers of the messages transmitted through the rustling oak leaves, helping human priests understand and communicate the often cryptic divine guidance provided by the speaking trees. The oak Dryads at Dodona developed sophisticated techniques for distinguishing between ordinary wind-caused leaf movements and genuine divine communications. They observed the specific patterns of leaf rustling, the timing of sound variations, and the correlation between atmospheric conditions and message clarity to determine when Zeus was actively transmitting oracular guidance. This expertise required centuries of careful observation and practice, as the differences between natural and supernatural oak communications were often subtle and easily misinterpreted by untrained observers. The transformation of Daphne into a laurel tree represents one of the most famous examples of metamorphosis between nymph and plant forms, illustrating the fluid boundaries between divine consciousness and natural phenomena that characterized ancient Greek understanding of tree spirits. Daphne, daughter of the river god Peneus, possessed the typical immortality and nature connection abilities of river nymphs, but her story demonstrates how extreme circumstances could fundamentally alter a nymph's form and function. Apollo's pursuit of Daphne began when Eros shot the god with a golden arrow that induced uncontrollable love, while simultaneously striking Daphne with a lead arrow that created equally powerful revulsion toward romantic attachment. The resulting chase across the Greek landscape became a cosmic drama that ended only when Daphne, exhausted by flight and facing capture, called upon her father and the earth itself to preserve her chastity through transformation. Her metamorphosis into a laurel tree occurred at the moment of Apollo's embrace, her divine essence merging with the plant's natural life force to create a new form of tree nymph existence. The laurel tree that Daphne became retained her consciousness and divine nature, while gaining the protection of permanent plant form that made her immune to further romantic pursuit. Apollo's subsequent adoption of the laurel as his sacred tree created ongoing connection between the transformed nymph and the god of prophecy, music and poetry. The laurel wreaths worn by victorious athletes and accomplished poets incorporated leaves from trees descended from Daphne's original transformation, carrying traces of her divine essence that enhanced the achievements they commemorated. The ecological significance of sacred forests in ancient Greece extended far beyond their religious functions to encompass crucial environmental services that sustained both human communities and natural ecosystems. Sacred groves served as protected watersheds that regulated water flow and prevented erosion, their tree nymph guardians actively maintaining the forest conditions necessary for optimal hydrological function. The roots of sacred trees stabilized soil on hillsides and mountain slopes, while their canopies moderated local climate conditions and provided habitat for numerous animal species. The religious protection afforded to sacred groves created some of the earliest examples of systematic forest conservation in human history. Communities that maintained these woodland sanctuaries developed sophisticated understanding of forest ecology, recognizing the connections between tree health, soil fertility, water quality, and agricultural productivity. The tree nymphs served as sources of ecological knowledge, providing guidance about sustainable harvesting practices, optimal planting locations, and the management techniques necessary for maintaining healthy forest ecosystems. Ancient Greek law codes incorporated specific provisions protecting nymph-inhabited groves from unauthorized cutting, grazing, or other forms of damage that might harm their divine residents. The penalties for violating these natural sanctuaries ranged from monetary fines and ritual purification requirements to more severe punishments including exile or death, depending on the severity of the offence and the importance of the affected grove. These legal protections reflected widespread recognition that the destruction of sacred forests could provoke divine retribution, affecting entire communities rather than just individual offenders. The consequences of violating natural sanctuaries typically manifested through ecological disasters that demonstrated the connection between divine displeasure and environmental degradation. Communities that allowed unauthorized cutting in sacred groves often experienced crop failures, water source contamination, or unusual weather patterns that disrupted normal agricultural cycles. These environmental consequences served as powerful deterrents to further violations while reinforcing cultural beliefs about the importance of maintaining proper relationships with the divine forces inhabiting natural landscapes. The enforcement of grove protection laws required cooperation between human authorities and the tree nymphs themselves, creating partnerships that benefited both divine and mortal communities. Dryads and Hamadryads would report violations to local priests or civic officials, while human guardians provided physical protection against threats that exceeded the nymphs' defensive capabilities. This collaborative approach to forest conservation created sustainable management systems that preserved sacred groves for centuries while allowing surrounding communities to benefit from their ecological services. The Oreads commanded the wild, untamed territories that rose above human settlements, their domain encompassing every mountain peak, rocky outcrop, highland meadow, and alpine forest throughout the Greek world. These mountain nymphs possessed physical capabilities that reflected the harsh environments they inhabited, extraordinary strength that enabled them to traverse vertical cliff faces, endurance that allowed them to survive in thin mountain air, and agility that let them navigate treacherous terrain that would prove fatal to ordinary mortals. Their bodies adapted to altitude changes with supernatural efficiency, their lungs processing the rarefied air of high peaks, while their muscles generated the power necessary for climbing and leaping across seemingly impossible distances. The appearance of individual Oreads varied according to the specific mountain environments they inhabited, their physical characteristics reflecting the geological and climatic conditions of their territories. Those dwelling on snow-capped peaks possessed pale, almost translucent skin that seemed to glow with reflected sunlight, their hair often appearing white or silver like fresh snow. Their clothing consisted of furs from mountain animals and fabrics woven from cloud-like materials that provided warmth without restricting movement. Rocky outcrop Oreads developed more rugged appearances, their skin taking on the coloration and texture of local stone, while their garments incorporated mineral deposits and crystalline formations that sparkled in sunlight. Forest-dwelling mountain nymphs combined characteristics of both Oreads and Dryads, their dual nature allowing them to move freely between wooded slopes and bare rocky summits. These hybrid nymphs possessed the tree connection abilities of their woodland cousins, while maintaining the physical prowess necessary for mountain survival. Their knowledge of alpine plant life made them valuable sources of information about medicinal herbs that grew only at high altitudes, including rare species whose healing properties surpassed those of lowland plants. Ancient Greek physicians would seek out these mountain forest nymphs to obtain guidance about the collection and preparation of specialized remedies for conditions that resisted conventional treatment. The association between Oreads and Artemis represented one of the most significant divine partnerships in Greek mythology, establishing the mountain nymphs as essential companions to the virgin goddess of the hunt. Artemis selected her nymph attendants from the most skilled and dedicated Oreads, those who demonstrated exceptional archery abilities, tracking skills, and commitment to maintaining their chastity. These chosen companions formed an elite hunting party that accompanied Artemis on her expeditions throughout the mountainous regions of Greece, their combined skills making them the most formidable hunting force in the divine realm. The training regimen for Artemis's Oread companions involved rigorous physical conditioning that pushed even these supernatural beings to their limits. New recruits underwent months of intensive preparation that included long-distance running across mountain ranges, precision archery practice in challenging weather conditions, and stealth training that taught them to move silently through dense forests and across loose scree slopes. The goddess personally supervised these training exercises, her exacting standards ensuring that only the most capable Oreads earned positions in her hunting retinue. The hunting expeditions led by Artemis and her Oread companions served multiple purposes beyond mere recreational activity. These divine hunting parties helped maintain ecological balance in mountain regions by controlling populations of dangerous predators and removing diseased animals that could spread illness to healthy herds. The Oreads' intimate knowledge of animal behaviour patterns enabled them to identify threats to mountain ecosystems before they could cause significant damage, while their supernatural abilities allowed them to implement solutions that would have been impossible for mortal hunters. The weapons employed by Artemis's Oread companions reflected both their divine nature and their mountain environment. Each nymph carried a silver bow crafted by the Cyclops, its construction incorporating materials from her specific mountain domain, obsidian arrowheads from volcanic peaks, bowstrings made from sinew of mountain lions, and quivers decorated with feathers from eagles that nested on the highest cliffs. These personalised weapons possessed enhanced accuracy and power when used within the nymph's home territory, their effectiveness diminishing gradually as the distance from their mountain of origin increased. The code of chastity maintained by Artemis's Oread attendants created a distinctive subculture within mountain nymph society, as these virgin nymphs developed different priorities and behaviours compared to their sisters who engaged in romantic relationships with gods, heroes, and mortals. The chaste Oreads focused their energies entirely on perfecting their hunting skills and deepening their understanding of mountain ecology, their celibate lifestyle, freeing them from the emotional complications and divided loyalties that often affected other nymphs. This single-minded dedication made them extraordinarily effective guardians of their mountain territories and loyal servants of their divine patron. The enforcement of chastity among Artemis's companions required constant vigilance, as the beauty and skill of these elite Oreads attracted attention from male gods, heroes, and even mortal men who encountered them during mountain expeditions. Ancient sources describe numerous incidents where potential suitors attempted to court or capture individual Oreads, leading to violent confrontations that demonstrated the nymphs' fierce commitment to maintaining their virginity. These encounters often resulted in the transformation or destruction of the would-be seducers, serving as warnings to others who might harbour similar intentions. The punishment of Actaeon represents the most famous example of the consequences that awaited those who violated the privacy or chastity of Artemis and her Oread companions. When the young hunter accidentally observed the goddess and her nymphs bathing in a mountain spring, his transformation into a stag and subsequent death at the jaws of his own hunting dogs demonstrated the severe penalties imposed for even unintentional violations of divine modesty. The Oreads present during this incident participated actively in Actaeon's punishment, their outrage at the breach of their privacy contributing to the severity of his transformation and the certainty of his death. The seasonal migration patterns of mountain-dwelling animals created annual cycles of activity for the Oreads, who monitored and protected these creatures. During spring and summer months, when wildlife moved to higher elevations seeking cooler temperatures and fresh grazing, the mountain nymphs became more active in their protective roles, guarding vulnerable young animals and ensuring adequate food supplies for growing populations. The autumn hunting season required increased vigilance as both divine and mortal hunters pursued game preparing for winter, while winter months saw reduced Oread activity as many animals hibernated or descended to lower elevations. The Pleiades occupied a unique position among nymphs as stellar beings whose mythological significance extended far beyond their individual stories to encompass fundamental aspects of ancient Greek astronomy, navigation, and agricultural timing. These seven sisters, Maia, Electra, Taygete, Alcyone, Celaeno, Sterope, and Merope, were born from the union of Atlas, the Titan condemned to hold up the heavens, and Pleione, an Oceanid whose name connected her to sailing and navigation. This parentage combined titanic strength and cosmic responsibility with oceanic knowledge and maritime expertise, creating daughters whose influence spanned both terrestrial and celestial realms. The individual personalities and mythological roles of the seven Pleiades reflected different aspects of stellar influence on human affairs. Maia, the eldest sister, achieved prominence through her relationship with Zeus and her role as mother to Hermes, the messenger god whose speed and cunning made him invaluable to both divine and mortal communities. Her position as the brightest star in the Pleiades cluster corresponded to her status as the most influential sister, her maternal connection to Hermes establishing ongoing links between the stellar nymphs and the Olympian pantheon. Electra's mythological significance derived from her role as mother to Dardanus, the legendary founder of Troy, establishing her as an ancestral figure whose stellar presence watched over one of the most important cities in ancient Greek literature. Ancient sources describe how Electra's star dimmed during the Trojan War, her grief over the destruction of her descendant's city, causing her light to fade until it became barely visible to human observers. This connection between stellar brightness and emotional states demonstrated the ongoing consciousness and concern that the transformed Pleiades maintained for earthly events affecting their mortal descendants. Taygetes' association with the mountain range that bore her name in the Peloponnese created important connections between her stellar form and specific geographic locations on Earth. Ancient Greeks observed that the Pleiades reached their highest point in the night sky when viewed from the Taygetus Mountains, interpreting this astronomical phenomenon as evidence of the nymph's continued connection to her terrestrial homeland. The timing of this celestial event coincided with important seasonal transitions that affected both agriculture and navigation, making Taygetes' star a crucial marker for ancient calendar systems. Alcyone's transformation into a star followed her tragic love affair with Poseidon and the birth of their children, who became important figures in various regional mythologies throughout the Greek world. Her stellar form served as a guide for sailors navigating the Mediterranean, her position in the night sky providing crucial directional information for maritime expeditions. The heliacal rising of Alcyone's star marked the beginning of the sailing season, while its setting warned of approaching winter storms that made sea travel dangerous for all but the most experienced mariners. Celaeno's darker mythological associations, including her connection to the Harpies in some traditions, influenced the interpretation of her stellar characteristics and the omens derived from her celestial behaviour. Ancient astronomers noted that Celaeno's star appeared dimmer and more variable than her sisters', its fluctuating brightness serving as a warning system for potential disasters or significant changes in political or social conditions. The timing of Celaeno's stellar variations often correlated with historical events such as wars, natural disasters, or the deaths of important political figures. Sterope's stellar form provided guidance for land-based navigation and agricultural timing, her position in the sky serving as a reference point for determining directions during nighttime travel across mountainous or forested terrain. Ancient Greek shepherds and traders who needed to move their flocks or goods during cooler nighttime hours relied on Sterope's star to maintain proper headings and avoid becoming lost in unfamiliar territory. Her brightness variations indicated weather changes that could affect travel conditions, making her observation essential for successful long-distance journeys. Merope represented the most tragic figure among the Pleiades, her marriage to the mortal Sisyphus resulting in her stellar form becoming the faintest and most difficult to observe among the seven sisters. Ancient sources explained her dimness as shame over her union with a mortal, who was later condemned to eternal punishment in the underworld, her reduced brightness reflecting her embarrassment at being the only Pleiad who chose a mortal husband rather than a god or hero. This mythological explanation provided ancient observers with a memorable way to identify Merope's star and understand the constellation's overall structure. The transformation of the Pleiades into stars occurred through different mechanisms according to various ancient sources, with some accounts describing their ascension as a reward for their virtue, and others presenting it as an escape from unwanted pursuit by Orion, the giant hunter who became obsessed with capturing the beautiful sisters. The most widely accepted version describes how the sisters' father Atlas requested Zeus to place his daughters in the sky to protect them from Orion's relentless chase, their stellar forms allowing them to remain forever beyond the hunter's reach, while continuing to influence earthly affairs through their celestial positions. The agricultural significance of the Pleiades extended throughout the ancient Mediterranean world, their seasonal appearances and disappearances serving as reliable indicators for crucial farming activities. The heliacal rising of the cluster in late spring signalled the optimal timing for planting crops that required warm weather for germination, while their setting in autumn indicated the approach of harvest season for summer crops. Ancient farmers developed detailed observational techniques for tracking the Pleiades' movements, their agricultural success depending heavily on accurate interpretation of these stellar signals. The maritime applications of Pleiades observation proved equally crucial for ancient navigation, as the cluster's position provided essential information for determining both direction and seasonal sailing conditions. The sisters' collective brightness made them visible even during partially cloudy conditions that obscured other stellar reference points, while their distinctive grouping made them easily recognizable to navigators with varying levels of astronomical training. Ancient sailing manuals included detailed instructions for using the Pleiades to determine latitude and longitude, their celestial position serving as a primary navigation aid for Mediterranean voyages. Echo achieved individual prominence among mountain nymphs through her tragic encounter with Hera's jealousy and her subsequent role in the myth of Narcissus, her story illustrating the complex relationships that could develop between nymphs and the major gods. Originally, Echo possessed normal speech abilities and served as a trusted companion to other mountain nymphs, her intelligence and wit making her a popular figure among her sisters. However, her involvement in Zeus's extramarital affairs led to divine punishment that fundamentally altered her nature and capabilities. Hera's discovery of Echo's role in distracting her during Zeus's romantic encounters resulted in a curse that stripped the mountain nymph of independent speech, leaving her able only to repeat the final words spoken by others. This punishment transformed Echo from an active participant in conversations to a passive respondent whose communications were limited to echoing the statements and questions directed toward her. The curse's severity reflected Hera's fury at being deceived, while its specific nature ensured that Echo could never again serve as an effective accomplice in Zeus's deceptions. The acoustic properties of mountain environments amplified the effects of Echo's curse, her repetitive speech creating the natural phenomenon that ancient Greeks used to explain the occurrence of sound echoes in rocky terrain. Mountainous regions with appropriate geological formations would carry Echo's repeated words across valleys and between cliff faces, her cursed voice becoming a permanent feature of the landscape that travellers could encounter throughout their mountain journeys. This mythological explanation provided ancient observers with a memorable framework for understanding acoustic phenomena, while preserving the tragic story of a nymph whose punishment exceeded her crime. Echo's unrequited love for Narcissus added additional layers of tragedy to her already cursed existence. Her inability to initiate conversation, preventing her from expressing her feelings directly to the beautiful youth who had captured her affections. Ancient sources describe her desperate attempts to communicate through repeated words and phrases, her echoed responses creating confusion and frustration that drove Narcissus away rather than attracting him to her cause. The limitation of her curse made genuine emotional connection impossible, as she could only reflect others' words rather than expressing her own thoughts and feelings. The wasting away of Echo's physical form following Narcissus's rejection transformed her from a visible mountain nymph into a purely acoustic presence, her body disappearing until only her voice remained to haunt mountain valleys and rocky gorges. This metamorphosis represented one of the most complete transformations in Greek mythology, as Echo lost not only her physical form, but also her ability to interact normally with other beings. Her continued existence as a disembodied voice demonstrated the permanence of divine curses and the tragic consequences that could result from involvement in divine politics. The nymphs of Mount Helicon occupied a privileged position among mountain nymphs through their association with the 9 Muses, the goddesses who governed artistic inspiration, intellectual achievement, and cultural refinement. These Heliconian nymphs served as attendants and companions to the Muses, a mountain domain providing an ideal environment for the creative and scholarly activities that characterized Muse worship. The springs and groves of Mount Helicon created natural amphitheatres and study spaces where poets, musicians and philosophers could seek divine inspiration while enjoying the protection and guidance of both the Muses and their nymph attendants. The Hippocrene spring on Mount Helicon owed its creation to the winged horse Pegasus, whose hoof strike against the mountain's rocky surface released waters that possessed the power to inspire poetic creativity in those who drank from them. The Naiad who governed this sacred spring worked closely with the Muses to ensure that the water's inspirational properties remained potent and accessible to worthy seekers of artistic excellence. Ancient poets would make pilgrimages to Hippocrene specifically to drink from its waters, believing that this ritual consumption would enhance their creative abilities and provide them with divine guidance for their literary works. The Aganepi spring, also located on Mount Helicon, served similar functions for different types of artistic endeavour, its waters particularly beneficial for musicians and dancers seeking to perfect their technical skills and emotional expression. The nymph Agenippe, for whom the spring was named, possessed specialised knowledge of rhythm, melody and movement that she shared with mortal visitors who approached her waters with appropriate reverence and artistic dedication. Her guidance proved especially valuable for young artists beginning their careers, as she could identify natural talents and provide specific recommendations for developing individual creative potential. The educational functions of Mount Helicon's nymphs extended beyond artistic inspiration to encompass broader intellectual development, their association with the Muses making them valuable sources of knowledge about mathematics, astronomy, history, and natural philosophy. Ancient scholars would establish temporary residences near the mountain springs and groves, spending months or even years in study and contemplation while receiving guidance from the resident nymphs. These educational retreats produced some of the most significant advances in ancient Greek learning, as the combination of divine inspiration and sustained intellectual effort created optimal conditions for scholarly achievement. The nymphs dwelling on Mount Ida held special significance in Greek mythology through their role in the infancy and education of Zeus, their mountain domain serving as the hidden location where the future king of the gods was raised in secret to protect him from his father Kronos' infanticidal intentions. These Idaean nymphs, led by Adrastia and Ida, possessed specialized knowledge of child-rearing and education that made them ideal guardians for the divine infant, whose survival was crucial for the eventual establishment of Olympian rule. The cave on Mount Ida, where Zeus spent his infancy, became a sacred site associated with divine nurturing and protection, its resident nymphs developing reputations as powerful guardians of children and young animals throughout their mountain territory. Ancient parents would bring sick or endangered children to shrines near the cave, seeking the nymphs' intervention and protection through offerings and prayers. The success of these appeals reinforced beliefs about the nymphs' protective powers while establishing ongoing relationships between local communities and their mountain guardians. The Curetes, divine beings who served as Zeus's protectors during his infancy, worked closely with the Idaean nymphs to conceal the infant god's presence from Kronos' searching attention. The nymphs provided practical childcare while the Curetes created noise and distractions that masked Zeus's cries, their collaborative efforts ensuring the future god's survival during his most vulnerable period. This partnership between different types of divine beings demonstrated the complex cooperative relationships that characterized ancient Greek divine society. The orographic phenomena controlled by mountain nymphs encompass the full range of atmospheric and geological processes that characterized highland environments, their divine influence extending from local weather patterns to major seismic events that could reshape entire mountain ranges. Oreads possessed intimate understanding of the atmospheric dynamics that created mountain weather. Their ability to sense approaching storms temperature changes and wind shifts, making them valuable sources of meteorological information for travelers, shepherds, and hunters who needed to navigate safely through challenging mountain conditions. The formation of orographic clouds occurred through the interaction between rising air masses and the divine influence of mountain nymphs, who could enhance or suppress cloud formation according to the needs of their territories and the behavior of human visitors. Beneficial clouds provided essential moisture for mountain vegetation and created the dramatic visual effects that made sacred peaks appear mystical and otherworldly. Conversely, threatening storm clouds served as warnings to inappropriate visitors while protecting sacred sites from unwanted intrusion. Avalanche control represented one of the most dramatic manifestations of Oread power, their ability to trigger or prevent massive snowslides, providing both protection for their mountain domains and punishment for those who violated sacred spaces or showed disrespect to mountain environments. Ancient sources describe how experienced mountain travelers would seek the favor of local Oreads through appropriate offerings and prayers before attempting to cross avalanche-prone slopes, understanding that divine displeasure could result in deadly snowslides that buried entire expeditions. The sacred nature of high places in Greek religion reflected beliefs about the closer proximity between mountain peaks and the divine realm, their elevation creating natural bridges between earth and sky that facilitated communication with the gods. Mountain nymphs served as intermediaries in these communications, their residence at high altitudes enabling them to receive and transmit messages between mortal supplicants and divine recipients. The thin air and dramatic landscapes of mountain peaks created atmospheric conditions that enhanced spiritual experiences and made divine encounters more likely for properly prepared individuals. The literary transformation of nymphs from religious figures into complex narrative characters reached its zenith in the epic poetry of Homer, where these divine beings assumed crucial roles that extended far beyond their traditional functions as nature spirits. In the Iliad and Odyssey, nymphs emerged as active participants in the great heroic narratives that defined Greek cultural identity, their interventions shaping the course of events that determine the fate of heroes, cities, and entire civilizations. This literary evolution represented a fundamental shift in how ancient Greeks conceptualized nymph mythology, moving from localized cult worship toward universal themes of divine intervention, maternal protection, and the complex relationships between immortal beings and mortal heroes. Thetis's role in the Iliad demonstrates the sophisticated narrative techniques Homer employed to integrate nymph mythology into epic storytelling while maintaining the theological complexity that characterized these divine beings. As Achilles' mother, Thetis possessed foreknowledge of her son's destiny, the choice between a long, obscure life and a brief existence crowned with eternal glory. This prophetic awareness created dramatic tension throughout the epic, as readers understood that Thetis's maternal interventions occurred against the backdrop of inevitable tragedy. Her attempts to protect Achilles through divine armor, forged by Hephaestus, and her appeals to Zeus for honor and recognition, represented the desperate efforts of an immortal mother confronting the limitations of even divine power against the inexorable nature of fate. The political dimensions of Thetis's interventions reveal Homer's understanding of nymph mythology as a vehicle for exploring themes of divine justice and cosmic order. When Agamemnon dishonored Achilles by claiming Briseis, Thetis's appeal to Zeus resulted in Greek military disasters that demonstrated the consequences of violating proper relationships between mortals and their divine protectors. Her ability to move freely between the marine realm, the battlefield, and Mount Olympus positioned her as a unique intermediary capable of translating mortal grievances into divine action. The temporary withdrawal of Achilles from battle, orchestrated through Thetis's influence with Zeus, created the narrative space necessary for exploring themes of honor, responsibility, and the price of heroic achievement. The crafting of Achilles' divine armour represents one of the most detailed descriptions of divine manufacturing in ancient literature, with Thetis serving as the intermediary who commissioned Hephaestus to create weapons and protection that surpassed anything available to ordinary mortals. The shield's elaborate decorations, depicting scenes of peace and war, agriculture and conflict, demonstrated how nymph interventions could introduce cosmic perspectives into human conflicts. Through Thetis's request, Achilles received not merely superior equipment but symbolic representations of the entire human condition, his mother's divine connections, providing him with armour that reflected both his heroic status and his tragic destiny. The funeral lamentations led by Thetis and her sister Nereids following Achilles' death created some of the most emotionally powerful passages in ancient literature, their divine grief serving as a cosmic acknowledgement of heroic achievement while simultaneously emphasizing the universal nature of loss and mourning. Homer's description of the sea nymphs emerging from their underwater realm to join in collective lamentation transformed a personal tragedy into a cosmic event that bridged the gap between divine and mortal experience. The participation of all 50 Nereids in these funeral rites established precedents for understanding heroic death as events that affected the entire divine hierarchy, rather than merely local human communities. Calypso's detention of Odysseus on the island of Ogygia represents perhaps the most psychologically complex nymph-hero relationship in ancient literature, her 7-year imprisonment of the hero, exploring themes of desire, power, and the tension between divine will and mortal agency. Unlike the protective maternal relationship between Thetis and Achilles, Calypso's interaction with Odysseus involved romantic obsession that transformed her from a beneficent host into an unwilling captor whose love became a form of imprisonment. Homer's portrayal of this relationship avoided simple characterizations of good and evil, instead presenting a nuanced exploration of how divine affection could become destructive when it conflicted with mortal desires and obligations. The island of Ogygia itself functioned as a liminal space where normal temporal and social rules operated differently, its isolation from the mortal world creating an environment where Calypso's divine nature could fully manifest while simultaneously cutting Odysseus off from his human identity and responsibilities. The nymph's ability to offer immortality to her captive lover represented the ultimate expression of divine generosity, yet Odysseus's rejection of this gift demonstrated the fundamental differences between divine and mortal perspectives on existence and fulfillment. His preference for mortal life with Penelope over eternal existence with Calypso established important themes about the value of human relationships and the meaning of heroic identity. The intervention of Hermes, acting on Zeus's orders, to secure Odysseus's release reveal the complex political dynamics that govern divine society and the limitations placed on even powerful nymphs by the broader cosmic hierarchy. Calypso's reluctant compliance with Zeus's command, expressed through bitter complaints about the double standards applied to male and female deities, provided Homer with opportunities to explore gender dynamics within divine society while advancing the epic's plot toward its eventual resolution. Her final assistance in constructing Odysseus's raft and providing favourable winds for his departure demonstrated the transformation of possessive love into genuine care for the beloved's well-being. The Phaeacian episode that followed Odysseus's escape from Ogygia introduced additional nymph figures whose interactions with the hero served different narrative functions while maintaining thematic continuity with earlier divine encounters. The river god's daughter who aided Odysseus after Poseidon's storm destroyed his raft represented the beneficial aspects of nymph intervention, her timely assistance providing both physical salvation and spiritual renewal for the exhausted hero. This encounter established important contrasts with Calypso's possessive love, demonstrating how divine assistance could support rather than hinder heroic achievement when properly aligned with cosmic justice and mortal needs. Hesiod's treatment of nymphs in the Theogony and Works and Days established foundational frameworks for understanding these divine beings within broader cosmological and agricultural contexts. His systematic approach to divine genealogy providing later poets with authoritative sources for nymph mythology, while his practical agricultural advice demonstrated their continued relevance to daily human activities. The Theogony's enumeration of specific Oceanids, Nereids, and other nymph categories created a comprehensive divine catalogue that influenced subsequent literary treatments, while establishing clear hierarchical relationships between different types of nymphs and their positions within the broader divine cosmos. The Works and Days incorporated nymph references into practical, agricultural guidance, their seasonal activities and territorial associations, providing farmers with divine frameworks for understanding optimal timing for planting, harvesting, and other crucial agricultural activities. Hesiod's description of how different nymphs influenced weather patterns, soil fertility, and water availability created practical applications for mythological knowledge while maintaining religious reverence for these divine beings. His advice about maintaining proper relationships with local nymphs through offerings and ritual observances demonstrated the continued importance of these figures in rural Greek life during the Archaic period. The genealogical complexity presented in Hesiod's works provided later poets with rich source material for developing individual nymph narratives while establishing canonical relationships between nymphs and major gods that would influence literary treatments for centuries. His systematic approach to divine lineages created authoritative frameworks that subsequent authors could reference, modify, or expand according to their specific narrative needs. The Theogony's emphasis on the primordial origins of nymph categories established their fundamental importance to cosmic order while providing explanations for their diverse powers and territorial associations. Pindar's victory odes transformed nymph mythology into vehicles for celebrating athletic achievement and civic pride, his complex lyrical compositions weaving together local nymph traditions, heroic genealogies, and contemporary political themes to create sophisticated poetic works that honoured both divine and human excellence. The Epinician odes frequently invoked local nymphs as protective deities who had fostered the athletic abilities being celebrated, their territorial associations with specific cities or regions providing divine sanction for contemporary achievements while connecting present victories to mythological precedents. The Olympian odes incorporated nymph references into elaborate mythological narratives that explained the origins of athletic festivals and the divine favour that enabled exceptional human performance. Pindar's treatment of the nymphs who nursed infant gods or heroes established connections between mythological events and contemporary athletic achievements, his complex temporal structures allowing past divine actions to illuminate present human accomplishments. These poetic techniques created multi-layered compositions that functioned simultaneously as religious hymns, historical narratives, and celebratory performances. The Pythian odes celebrating victories at Delphi frequently referenced the prophetic nymphs associated with Apollo's oracle, their inspirational powers providing divine explanations for both athletic success and poetic achievement. Pindar's own role as a divinely inspired poet created natural connections between his artistic abilities and the nymph traditions surrounding prophetic springs and sacred groves. His complex metaphorical language often compared athletic victory to divine inspiration, the temporary transcendence achieved through exceptional physical performance, paralleling the spiritual elevation experienced through contact with prophetic nymphs. The Nemean and Isthmian odes developed regional nymph traditions specific to their respective festival sites. Pindar's detailed knowledge of local mythologies enabling him to create geographically specific references that honoured both the athletic victors and the divine beings who protected their home territories. These regional variations demonstrated the continued vitality of local nymph traditions during the classical period, while showing how skilled poets could integrate diverse mythological materials into coherent artistic compositions that served multiple cultural and political functions. The transformation of nymph mythology and Hellenistic poetry reflected broader cultural changes that accompanied the expansion of Greek civilization throughout the Mediterranean world and the development of more sophisticated literary techniques and aesthetic sensibilities. Theocritus and other pastoral poets created new poetic genres that romanticized rural life and nymph encounters, their idealized presentations of countryside existence, providing urban audiences with nostalgic visions of simpler times when humans maintained closer relationships with natural environments and their divine inhabitants. The Idylls of Theocritus established pastoral poetry as a distinct literary genre that would influence Western literature for centuries. His detailed descriptions of shepherd life and rural landscapes, creating fictional worlds where nymphs appeared as accessible, benevolent beings who could provide guidance, inspiration, and romantic fulfillment to properly respectful mortals. These pastoral compositions differed significantly from earlier epic treatments of nymphs, their smaller scale and intimate focus creating opportunities for exploring personal relationships and individual emotions, rather than cosmic themes and heroic destinies. The bucolic settings favoured by Hellenistic poets provided ideal environments for nymph encounters, their emphasis on springs, groves and meadows, creating natural spaces where the boundaries between mortal and divine realms became permeable. The shepherds and goat herds who populated these poems possessed the rural knowledge and religious sensitivity necessary for recognizing and interacting appropriately with nymphs. Their simple lifestyles and close connections to natural environments making them ideal intermediaries between urban readers and the divine beings who inhabited wild places. The competitive singing contests that featured prominently in pastoral poetry often involved nymphs as judges or inspirational figures, their aesthetic sensibilities and divine authority providing frameworks for evaluating artistic merit, while their presence elevated rustic entertainments to the level of divine performance. These poetic competitions created opportunities for exploring themes of artistic inspiration, creative rivalry, and the relationship between natural beauty and human artistic achievement. The nymphs' roles as arbiters of aesthetic excellence established them as cultural authorities whose approval validated both individual artistic efforts and broader cultural values. The influence of nymph mythology on Roman authors created fascinating examples of cultural adaptation and literary transformation, as Latin poets incorporated Greek nymph traditions into works that served distinctly Roman political, social, and aesthetic purposes. Ovid's Metamorphoses represents perhaps the most comprehensive treatment of nymph transformation stories in ancient literature, his narrative techniques and psychological insights creating complex character studies that explored themes of desire, power, and identity, while maintaining connections to traditional mythological frameworks. The Metamorphoses presented nymph transformation stories as vehicles for examining fundamental questions about the nature of identity, consciousness, and the relationship between physical form and essential selfhood. Ovid's detailed descriptions of transformation processes created vivid psychological portraits that emphasized the emotional and spiritual dimensions of metamorphosis, while maintaining narrative momentum through skillful plotting and character development. His treatment of figures like Daphne, Echo, and the Hesperides demonstrated how traditional mythological materials could be adapted to serve sophisticated literary purposes while preserving their essential religious and cultural significance. Virgil's incorporation of nymph figures into the Aeneid and Eclogues demonstrated how these divine beings could serve both epic and pastoral literary functions within Roman cultural contexts. The Aeneid's treatment of nymphs as protective deities who aided Aeneas during his journey to Italy established them as supporters of Roman destiny while maintaining their traditional roles as nature spirits and divine intermediaries. The epic's emphasis on divine providence and historical necessity created frameworks within which nymph interventions could serve larger political and cultural themes while retaining their individual personalities and mythological associations. The eclogues developed pastoral themes that would profoundly influence later European literature. Virgil's sophisticated treatment of rural life and nymph encounters, creating idealized visions of countryside existence that served as implicit critiques of urban political corruption and social complexity. His shepherds possessed the cultural refinement and poetic sensibilities that enabled them to appreciate both natural beauty and divine presence, their conversations and singing contests demonstrating how rural environments could foster both artistic achievement and spiritual development. Propertius and other Roman elegiac poets adapted nymph mythology to serve the specific needs of love poetry, their treatment of these divine beings as examples of passionate devotion, tragic loss, and romantic fulfillment, providing mythological precedents for contemporary emotional experiences. The elegiac emphasis on personal emotion and individual psychology created opportunities for developing nymph characters as complex personalities whose divine nature enhanced rather than overshadowed their emotional authenticity and psychological realism. The adaptation of Greek nymph traditions to Roman cultural contexts required careful attention to religious sensibilities and political implications, as Latin poets needed to maintain respect for traditional divine hierarchies while serving the cultural and ideological needs of Roman audiences. The successful integration of nymph mythology into Roman literature demonstrated the flexibility and universal appeal of these divine figures while establishing precedents for their continued influence on subsequent Western literary traditions. The Roman treatment of nymphs as both exotic Greek imports and recognizable divine types created complex cultural negotiations that enrich both mythological understanding and literary achievement. The romantic entanglements between nymphs and the major gods of the Olympian pantheon created some of the most enduring and complex narratives in Greek mythology, establishing patterns of divine behavior that would influence religious thought and literary tradition for centuries. Zeus, whose appetite for romantic conquest knew virtually no bounds, pursued nymphs across every category and geographic region, his divine authority and shape-shifting abilities enabling him to overcome even the most determined resistance. The king of the gods demonstrated particular preference for nymphs, whose beauty was enhanced by their connection to specific natural environments, the crystal clarity of mountain springs reflected in their Naiad guardians, the wild grace of forest depths embodied by elusive Dryads, and the ethereal luminescence of starlight made manifest in celestial nymphs like the Pleiades. Zeus's pursuit of the Oceanid Metee represented more than mere romantic desire, as her reputation for wisdom and strategic thinking made her an invaluable political ally during his struggle against the Titans. Their union produced not only personal satisfaction for Zeus, but also the divine counsel that enabled his victory over the Old Order and his successful establishment of Olympian rule. However, the prophecy that Metee would bear a son greater than his father prompted Zeus to swallow his pregnant consort, demonstrating how even romantic relationships among the gods served broader cosmic purposes related to the maintenance of divine hierarchy and the prevention of generational overthrow. The absorption of Metee into Zeus's being created unprecedented intimacy between the king of the gods and nymph wisdom, her continued existence within his body providing him with the strategic intelligence necessary for complex political maneuvering and long-term planning. Ancient sources describe how Zeus would consult with the internalized Metee during crucial decision-making moments, her advice helping him navigate the treacherous waters of divine politics while maintaining his supremacy over potential rivals. The eventual birth of Athena from Zeus's head represented the external manifestation of this internal wisdom, the goddess of strategic warfare and intellectual achievement, embodying the combined divine heritage of her Olympian father and Oceanid mother. Zeus's numerous affairs with other nymphs followed patterns that revealed important aspects of divine psychology and cosmic order. His pursuit of the Pleiad Maya in a cave on Mount Selene resulted in the birth of Hermes, whose role as messenger god and divine trickster reflected both his father's authority and his mother's stellar wisdom. The secretive nature of this relationship, conducted away from Hera's jealous attention, established Maia as one of Zeus's most trusted companions, her discretion and loyalty earning her special protection and honour among the Pleiades. The cave where Hermes was born became a sacred site associated with divine communication and hidden knowledge, pilgrims seeking prophetic guidance or secret wisdom, making offerings to both the messenger god and his nymph mother. The transformation of Io into a heifer to protect her from Hera's wrath demonstrated the lengths to which Zeus would go to shield his nymph lovers from his wife's vengeance, though this protection often proved inadequate against Hera's determined persecution. Io's subsequent wanderings across the known world, driven by the gadfly sent by the jealous queen of the gods, created a geographic mythology that connected distant lands to Greek divine narratives while illustrating the cosmic scope of divine relationships and their consequences. Her eventual restoration to human form and deification as the Egyptian goddess Isis established important precedents for understanding how nymph-god relationships could transcend cultural boundaries and create lasting religious traditions. Europa's abduction by Zeus in the form of a white bull created one of the most geographically significant divine relationships in Greek mythology, as her transportation across the Mediterranean gave her name to the entire European continent, while establishing divine precedents for the Greek colonization that would follow centuries later. The bull's gentle demeanour and magnificent appearance initially attracted Europa's attention without revealing the god's true identity, demonstrating Zeus's sophisticated understanding of nymph psychology and his ability to adapt his approach to the specific preferences and sensibilities of individual targets. The subsequent revelation of his divine nature and the birth of their children, including the legendary king Minos of Crete, created lasting political and cultural connections between divine authority and mortal governance. The island of Crete became Zeus's gift to Europa, its fertile valleys and strategic location in the Mediterranean, making it an appropriate domain for a nymph who had captured the king of the god's enduring affection. Europa's role as Queen of Crete established important precedents for understanding how divine relationships could elevate nymphs to positions of significant political and cultural influence, their divine connections providing legitimacy for royal dynasties and religious traditions that would persist for generations. The Minoan civilization that flourished under her descendants incorporated numerous elements derived from nymph worship, including elaborate rituals honouring water spirits and sacred groves dedicated to tree nymphs. Poseidon's relationships with sea nymphs reflected both his domain over oceanic realms and his tempestuous personality, which manifested through passionate pursuits that could transform from gentle courtship to violent coercion depending on the recipient's response to his advances. His marriage to the Nereid Amphitrite established the most significant and enduring partnership between the sea god and nymph royalty, their union creating a stable foundation for marine governance while demonstrating the possibility of harmonious relationships between major gods and nymph nobility. Amphitrite's initial flight from Poseidon's advances and her eventual consent to marriage, negotiated through the diplomatic intervention of a dolphin, established important precedents for understanding divine courtship as a complex process requiring patience, persuasion, and respect for nymph autonomy. The royal couple's shared authority over oceanic phenomena created effective governance structures that managed everything from daily tides to major storms, their complementary abilities ensuring comprehensive oversight of marine environments and the creatures that inhabited them. Amphitrite's specialized knowledge of sea currents and marine life complemented Poseidon's raw power over earthquakes and tsunamis, their collaborative approach to oceanic management providing stability and predictability that enabled both divine and mortal communities to plan their activities around reliable patterns of sea behavior. Ancient sailors recognized both deities' authority through elaborate rituals that honoured their partnership while seeking protection for maritime ventures. Poseidon's affair with the Gorgon Medusa, before her transformation into a monster, resulted in the birth of the winged horse Pegasus and the giant Chrysaor, demonstrating how divine relationships with nymphs could produce offspring whose extraordinary abilities transcended normal categories of divine or mortal nature. The conception of these children within Athena's sacred temple violated religious protocols and contributed to Medusa's punishment, illustrating how divine passion could override religious propriety and create tragic consequences for the nymph partners who became unwilling participants in divine conflicts. Medusa's transformation from beautiful sea nymph to deadly monster served as a warning about the dangers that nymphs faced when they became involved in disputes between major gods. The birth of Pegasus from Medusa's severed neck created one of mythology's most striking images of divine generation. The winged horse emerging fully formed from his mother's blood, while inheriting both his father's connection to water and springs and his mother's former beauty and grace. Pegasus's ability to create springs by striking the ground with his hooves established ongoing connections between Poseidon's aquatic authority and terrestrial water sources, the horse's divine nature enabling him to serve as an intermediary between oceanic and freshwater realms. The most famous of these springs, Hippocrene on Mount Helicon, became sacred to the Muses and provided inspiration for poets who drank from its waters. Apollo's numerous pursuits of nymphs revealed both his artistic sensibilities and his sometimes destructive passion, his divine nature as god of music, poetry, and prophecy, creating complex relationships that could inspire extraordinary creativity or tragic transformation depending on the nymph's response to his advances. The story of Daphne represents perhaps the most famous example of nymph resistance to divine pursuit, her transformation into a laurel tree creating both a tragic love story and an explanation for Apollo's adoption of the laurel as his sacred plant. The chase across the Greek landscape became a cosmic drama that ended only when Daphne, exhausted by flight and facing capture, called upon her father Peneus and the earth itself to preserve her chastity through metamorphosis. Daphne's transformation occurred at the precise moment of Apollo's embrace, her divine essence merging with the laurel tree's natural life force to create a new form of existence that preserved her consciousness while making her forever inaccessible to romantic pursuit. Apollo's subsequent adoption of the laurel as his sacred tree created an ongoing connection between the transformed nymph and the god of prophecy, music, and poetry. The laurel wreaths worn by victorious athletes and accomplished poets incorporating leaves from trees descended from Daphne's original transformation. This botanical legacy ensured that Daphne's sacrifice continued to honour achievement and excellence throughout the ancient world. The relationship between Apollo and the nymph Siren demonstrated the more positive possibilities that could emerge from divine-nymph relationships, when mutual respect and shared interests created foundations for lasting partnership. Siren's reputation as a skilled huntress, and her fearless confrontation with a lion that threatened her father's flocks, attracted Apollo's admiration for her courage and competence, rather than merely her physical beauty. Their courtship involved genuine collaboration, as Apollo appreciated Siren's hunting skills and wilderness knowledge, while she valued his artistic abilities and divine wisdom. Apollo's transportation of Siren to North Africa and the founding of the city that bore her name created lasting monuments to their relationship, while establishing important precedents for Greek colonial expansion throughout the Mediterranean. The city of Cyrene became renowned for its prosperity and cultural achievements, its success attributed to the divine blessing conferred by the union of Apollo and his nymph consort. The region's famous Silphium plant, valued throughout the ancient world for its medicinal properties, was considered a gift from Cyrene to humanity, demonstrating how positive divine-nymph relationships could benefit entire civilizations. The birth of Aristeus from the union of Apollo and Cyrene produced a son whose diverse skills and beneficial influence on human civilization reflected the combined heritage of his divine father and nymph mother. Aristeus became the patron deity of beekeeping, olive cultivation, and cheese-making, his practical knowledge helping human communities develop sustainable agricultural practices while his divine nature enabled him to serve as an intermediary between gods and mortals. His role in teaching humanity essential survival skills demonstrated how the offspring of god-nymph unions could serve as cultural bridges that transmitted divine knowledge to mortal societies. The complex relationships between nymphs and heroes created some of the most psychologically rich narratives in Greek mythology, as these encounters explored themes of divine intervention in mortal affairs, the nature of heroic destiny, and the emotional bonds that connected immortal mothers to their mortal sons. Thetis's relationship with Achilles exemplified the tragic dimension of these maternal connections, her prophetic knowledge of his destiny creating constant tension between her desire to protect her son and her understanding that his greatest achievements required accepting mortal limitations and embracing heroic risk. Thetis's attempts to circumvent fate through various protective measures, including her effort to make Achilles invulnerable by dipping him in the river Styx, demonstrated both the power and limitations of nymph magic when applied to mortal heroes. The famous vulnerability of Achilles' heel, where Thetis held him during the immortalizing process, became a symbol of the inherent mortality that even divine protection could not completely overcome. This physical vulnerability reflected deeper themes about the nature of heroic identity and the necessity of accepting risk as an essential component of heroic achievement. The divine armour crafted by Hephaestus at Thetis's request represented one of the most detailed examples of divine manufacturing in ancient literature. The elaborate shield decorations depicting scenes of peace and war, agriculture and conflict, city life and rural pursuits. The shield's cosmic imagery provided Achilles with symbolic representations of the entire human condition, his mother's divine connections ensuring that he possessed not merely superior equipment, but artistic representations of the world he was destined to leave through heroic death. The armour's supernatural properties enhanced Achilles' already formidable fighting abilities while serving as visible reminders of his divine heritage and his mother's continuing love and protection. The concept of nympholepsy, or being seized by nymphs, represented one of the most psychologically complex aspects of divine-mortal relationships, describing a condition where mortals became obsessed with nymphs to the point of madness or complete withdrawal from human society. This phenomenon typically affected individuals who spent extensive time in wild places where nymphs were most active. Shepherds who grazed their flocks in remote mountain meadows, hunters who pursued game through dense forests, and travellers who sought shelter near isolated springs or groves. The initial encounter with a nymph could create such profound emotional and spiritual impact that the mortal became incapable of returning to normal human relationships and activities. The symptoms of nympholepsy varied depending on the type of nymph involved and the specific circumstances of the encounter, but typically included obsessive behaviour focused on returning to the location where the divine meeting occurred, inability to concentrate on practical matters or maintain social relationships, and gradual withdrawal from human community into solitary existence. Individuals affected by this condition would spend days or weeks searching for their nymph obsession, often neglecting basic needs for food, shelter, and human companionship while pursuing an impossible dream of renewed divine contact. The madness could manifest as either melancholic depression or manic excitement, both states reflecting the psychological disruption caused by exposure to divine beauty and otherworldly experience. Ancient Greek physicians recognized nympholepsy as a distinct medical condition with identifiable symptoms and predictable progression, though their understanding of its causes incorporated both naturalistic and supernatural elements. Some medical writers attributed the condition to environmental factors, such as exposure to certain plants that grew near nymph habitats, unusual atmospheric conditions in sacred groves, or the consumption of water from springs with specific mineral compositions that could affect mental function. Other authorities emphasized the purely divine nature of the affliction, arguing that nympholepsy resulted from direct supernatural intervention that overwhelmed mortal psychological capacity. Treatment for nympholepsy required careful attention to both physical and spiritual aspects of the condition, as purely medical interventions proved inadequate for addressing the divine elements that contributed to the affliction. Successful therapy typically involved gradual reintegration into human society through structured activities that provided alternative focuses for the patient's attention and emotional energy. Religious purification rituals designed to sever inappropriate connections with divine beings formed essential components of treatment, while ongoing supervision ensured that recovered individuals avoided situations that might trigger relapses into obsessive behaviour. The stories of shepherds and hunters who encountered nymphs in remote locations provided ancient audiences with cautionary tales about the dangers of venturing too far into wild places without proper spiritual preparation and protection. These narratives typically followed predictable patterns. A mortal man pursuing his occupation in wilderness areas would encounter a nymph whose beauty and otherworldly nature created immediate infatuation, leading to pursuit and either rejection or temporary acceptance followed by abandonment. The mortal's subsequent obsession with recovering the divine relationship would result in gradual deterioration of his connection to human society and eventual death from neglect, exposure, or accident. The shepherd Daphnis, whose story became foundational for pastoral poetry, exemplified both the positive and tragic possibilities inherent in nymph-mortal relationships. His musical abilities and natural sensitivity to beauty made him particularly susceptible to nymph attraction, while his pastoral lifestyle provided numerous opportunities for encounters with divine beings who inhabited the rural landscapes where he worked. The various versions of his story explored different outcomes for such relationships. Some traditions described his death from unrequited love, while others portrayed his transformation into a divine being through nymph intervention. The hunter Actaeon's accidental observation of Artemis and her nymph companions bathing demonstrated the severe consequences that could result from even unintentional violations of divine privacy and modesty. His transformation into a stag and subsequent death at the jaws of his own hunting dogs served as a powerful warning about the importance of maintaining appropriate boundaries between mortal and divine realms. The participating nymphs' outrage at the breach of their privacy contributed to the severity of Actaeon's punishment, their collective anger ensuring that his transformation would be permanent and his death inevitable. The fundamental incompatibility between divine and human nature created inherent tragic dimensions in relationships between nymphs and mortals, as even the most positive encounters ultimately confronted the insurmountable barriers created by differences in mortality, consciousness, and cosmic purpose. Nymphs possessed eternal perspectives that enabled them to observe the rise and fall of civilizations, the birth and death of countless generations, and the slow transformation of natural environments over geological timescales. Mortals, conversely, experienced existence through the limited framework of human lifespans. Their concerns focused on immediate needs, personal relationships, and achievements that could be accomplished within the constraints of mortal time. These temporal differences created communication barriers that prevented genuine understanding between divine and human consciousness, even when both parties possessed sincere affection and mutual respect. A nymph's casual reference to events that occurred centuries earlier might seem like ancient history to her mortal companion, while his urgent concerns about immediate problems could appear trivial from her eternal perspective. The gradual recognition of these fundamental differences often transformed initial attraction and infatuation into frustration, loneliness, and eventual separation as both parties realized the impossibility of achieving lasting emotional intimacy across such vast experiential gaps. The physical differences between nymphs and mortals created additional complications that affected both romantic and platonic relationships, as divine bodies possessed capabilities and requirements that exceeded human understanding and accommodation. Nymphs could survive in environments that would prove fatal to mortals, a connection to specific natural elements enabling them to thrive in conditions of extreme temperature, altitude, or atmospheric composition. Their supernatural strength and endurance made them capable of feats that mortals could witness but never replicate, while their enhanced senses provided them with awareness of subtle environmental changes that remained imperceptible to human observation. The stories of transformation that concluded many nymph-mortal relationships served multiple narrative functions, providing resolution for impossible romantic situations while creating explanations for natural phenomena and establishing precedents for understanding divine intervention in human affairs. The transformation of rejected lovers into plants, animals, or geographic features offered alternatives to simple death as consequences for failed divine relationships, while simultaneously creating permanent monuments to the emotional intensity that characterized these encounters. The spring that emerged from a lover's tears, the tree that grew from his transformed body, or the rock formation that preserved his final pose, provided lasting reminders of the power and tragedy inherent in divine mortal relationships. These transformation stories also served important religious functions by establishing sacred sites where communities could honor both the transformed mortal and the nymph whose relationship had created the local landmark. Pilgrims would visit these locations seeking healing, inspirational guidance, their offerings and prayers maintaining ongoing connections between contemporary worshippers and the mythological events that had sanctified the sites. The accumulated religious activity at transformation sites often enhanced their natural properties, creating springs with unusual healing powers or groves with enhanced spiritual atmosphere that validated the original mythological explanations for their existence. The archaeological record reveals extensive evidence of nymph worship throughout the ancient Greek world, with excavations uncovering thousands of votive offerings, dedicatory inscriptions and sanctuary sites that demonstrate the profound religious significance these divine beings held for local communities across more than a millennium of Greek civilization. Sanctuary sites dedicated to nymphs have been identified from the Black Sea colonies in the north to Cyrenaica in North Africa, the geographic distribution reflecting both the universal appeal of nymph worship and its adaptation to diverse local environments and cultural needs. The material remains from these sites provide invaluable insights into the daily religious practices of ordinary Greeks who sought divine assistance from the nymphs governing their local water sources, forests, and mountains. Votive offerings discovered at nymph sanctuaries display remarkable consistency in their types and materials, despite spanning centuries and covering vast geographic distances. Clay figurines representing female figures, often holding water vessels or depicted in dancing poses, constitute the most common category of dedications, their simple manufacture and widespread distribution indicating that nymph worship attracted devotees from all social classes rather than serving exclusively elite religious needs. These terracotta offerings typically measure between 10 and 20 centimeters in height, their modest scale reflecting both economic accessibility and the intimate nature of personal relationships between individual worshippers and their local nymph protectors. Bronze mirrors, jewellery and personal ornaments form another significant category of nymph dedications, their presence at sanctuary sites reflecting beliefs about divine interest in human beauty and personal adornment. The mirrors often bear inscriptions identifying the dedicator and specifying the particular favour being sought: restoration of youthful appearance, success in romantic relationships, or protection during childbirth. The quality of these bronze objects varies considerably, from simple polished discs with minimal decoration to elaborate pieces featuring engraved scenes of nymph activities and mythological narratives. The inclusion of personal jewellery among votive offerings suggests that worshippers believed nymphs appreciated beautiful objects and would respond favourably to gifts that demonstrated both material sacrifice and aesthetic sensibility. Miniature vessels for water, oil and perfume appear frequently among nymph dedications, their functional designs reflecting the practical concerns that motivated much ancient religious activity. These small containers, typically crafted from clay or bronze, were often filled with substances relevant to the specific nymph being honoured: spring water for Naiads, sea water for Nereids, or aromatic oils for tree nymphs. The vessels themselves sometimes display decorative elements that identify their intended recipients, including wave patterns for sea nymphs, leaf motifs for forest dwellers, or geometric designs representing mountain formations. The standardized forms of these containers suggest the existence of established workshop traditions that specialized in producing religious objects for nymph worship. Inscriptional evidence from nymph sanctuaries provides detailed information about the social composition of nymph worship communities and the specific concerns that motivated religious dedications. The dedicatory formulas typically follow standard patterns that identify the worshipper, specify the divine recipient, and state the reason for the offering, though regional variations reflect local linguistic preferences and religious customs. A typical inscription from a Naiad sanctuary might read, "Apollodoros, son of Dionysios, dedicated this to the nymphs of the spring in gratitude for healing his daughter's fever," while sea nymph dedications often reference successful voyages or protection from storms. The social status of nymph worshippers, as revealed through inscriptional evidence, encompasses the full spectrum of ancient Greek society, from wealthy aristocrats to freed slaves and foreign residents. This broad social participation distinguishes nymph worship from some other religious cults that attracted primarily elite or exclusively citizen participation, suggesting that the practical benefits associated with nymph favour, clean water, agricultural fertility, protection during travel, addressed universal human needs that transcended social boundaries. Women appear as dedicators in roughly equal numbers to men, their prominent participation reflecting both the traditionally female associations of many nymph activities and the absence of gender restrictions that characterize some other ancient religious practices. Professional groups frequently appear as collective dedicators at nymph sanctuaries, their occupational needs creating natural connections to specific types of nymphs whose divine authority encompassed relevant economic activities. Fishermen's associations regularly dedicated nets, hooks, and model boats at Nereid sanctuaries, seeking divine protection for their dangerous maritime occupations and favourable conditions for profitable fishing. Potters' guilds honoured spring nymphs whose pure water was essential for clay preparation and ceramic production, while perfume manufacturers sought the favour of flower nymphs whose influence determined the quality and availability of aromatic plants used in their products. The architectural features of nymph sanctuaries reflect both practical requirements for ritual activities and theological concepts about the appropriate environments for divine-human interaction. Unlike the monumental temples constructed for major Olympian deities, nymph sanctuaries typically emphasize natural settings that enhanced rather than dominated existing landscape features. Sacred springs were often enclosed within modest stone structures that protected the water source while allowing access for ritual purification and offering deposition. These architectural interventions maintained the natural character of the sites while providing necessary facilities for organized religious activities. Cave sanctuaries dedicated to nymphs represent some of the most atmospheric and psychologically powerful religious sites in the ancient world, their underground locations creating environments that enhanced spiritual experiences through sensory manipulation and symbolic associations with chthonic realms. The famous Carytian cave on Mount Parnassus, sacred to the nymphs and Pan, featured natural chambers that acoustic properties that amplified sound and created echo effects during religious ceremonies. Worshippers entering these underground spaces experienced dramatic temperature changes, altered lighting conditions, and acoustic phenomena that reinforced beliefs about divine presence and supernatural activity. The water management systems incorporated into many nymph sanctuaries demonstrate sophisticated understanding of hydraulic engineering and religious symbolism, their designs creating controlled environments for ritual activities while preserving the natural characteristics that made specific sites sacred. Spring sanctuaries often featured elaborate channel systems that directed water flow through successive pools, each serving different ritual functions, initial purification, offering deposition, and final blessing ceremonies. These engineered water features maintained constant flow rates and prevented contamination while creating visually impressive displays that enhanced the perceived power and beauty of the resident nymphs. Artificial grottos constructed at nymph sanctuaries throughout the Hellenistic and Roman periods represented sophisticated attempts to recreate natural cave environments in locations where suitable geological formations did not exist naturally. These architectural constructions, known as nymphaea, incorporated advanced engineering techniques including vaulted ceilings, hydraulic systems, and decorative programs that created convincing artificial environments for nymph worship. The most elaborate examples featured mechanical devices that created moving water displays, automated musical instruments, and lighting effects that simulated natural phenomena associated with divine presence. The Nymphaeum tradition evolved from simple spring enclosures to elaborate architectural complexes that served both religious and civic functions, their development reflecting changing attitudes toward divine-human relationships and the increasing urbanization of Greek society. Early nymphaea maintained close connections to natural water sources and emphasized the practical benefits of nymph worship: clean water for drinking and bathing, irrigation for agriculture, and power for mills and workshops. Later examples incorporated more elaborate decorative programs and entertainment features that transformed nymph sanctuaries into social centers that served broader community needs beyond purely religious functions. The decorative programs of monumental nymphaea typically included sculptural representations of nymphs in various activities: dancing, playing musical instruments, pouring water from vessels, or interacting with other divine beings. These artistic programs served both aesthetic and educational functions, their narrative scenes teaching worshippers about nymph mythology, while creating visually impressive environments that demonstrated community wealth and cultural sophistication. The sculptural quality varies considerably depending on available resources and local artistic traditions, ranging from simple relief carvings to elaborate freestanding statues executed by skilled professional artists. Ritual practices associated with nymph worship emphasized personal purification, natural offerings, and seasonal celebrations that aligned human activities with the natural cycles governed by these divine beings. Morning rituals typically began with purification ceremonies that involved washing hands and face in sacred springs while reciting prayers that acknowledged the nymph's authority over water purity and healing properties. These purification practices served both practical and spiritual functions, ensuring physical cleanliness while establishing proper ritual relationships between worshippers and their divine protectors. The offering of flowers, honey, and milk represented the most characteristic elements of nymph ritual practice, their selection reflecting both practical considerations and symbolic associations that connected these substances to nymph nature and powers. Fresh flowers were gathered each morning from meadows and gardens near sanctuary sites, their beauty and fragrance serving as appropriate gifts for divine beings whose own appearance embodied natural beauty and grace. The specific flower types varied according to seasonal availability and regional preferences, though roses, violets, and narcissus appear frequently in ancient sources describing nymph offerings. Honey offerings reflected beliefs about the special relationship between nymphs and bees, whose production of this sweet substance from flower nectar created natural connections between different aspects of the natural world governed by various nymph categories. The honey was typically presented in small ceramic vessels that were either left at sanctuary sites or poured directly into sacred springs and pools. Ancient sources describe how the honey dissolved in sacred waters, its sweetness believed to please the resident nymphs, while its golden colour symbolised the divine light and purity associated with these benevolent beings. Milk offerings, usually obtained from goats or sheep that grazed in areas near nymph sanctuaries, emphasised the nurturing and maternal aspects of nymph nature, while providing practical sustenance that demonstrated worshipper generosity and devotion. The milk was typically offered fresh each morning, its white colour symbolising purity and innocence, while its nutritional value acknowledged nymph roles in fostering growth and fertility. Ancient ritual texts specify that the milk should be obtained from animals that had never been used for work, ensuring that the offering maintained the natural purity appropriate for divine consumption. Sacred dances performed at nymph festivals created community-wide celebrations that combined religious devotion with social entertainment. Their choreographed movements and musical accompaniment designed to honour divine recipients while providing opportunities for collective participation in religious activities. These dances typically involved circular movements that symbolised natural cycles and seasonal changes, their participants wearing garlands of flowers and flowing garments that emphasised grace and natural beauty. The dance steps often incorporated gestures that mimicked nymph activities, pouring water, tending plants, or playing musical instruments. The musical accompaniment for nymph dances featured instruments associated with pastoral life and natural environments, reed pipes, simple lyres, and percussion instruments made from natural materials. The melodies typically employed modes that ancient music theorists associated with peaceful, contemplative emotional states, their gentle rhythms and harmonious intervals creating atmospheric conditions conducive to spiritual reflection and divine communion. Professional musicians often participated in major nymph festivals, their skilled performances enhancing the aesthetic quality of religious celebrations, while demonstrating community commitment to honouring their divine protectors with appropriate artistic excellence. Purification ceremonies conducted at nymph sanctuaries served both individual and community needs. Their ritual procedures designed to remove spiritual contamination while establishing proper relationships between human participants and divine powers. Individual purification typically involved bathing in sacred springs or pools, while reciting prayers that acknowledged personal shortcomings and requested divine forgiveness and protection. These personal rituals could be performed daily or in response to specific circumstances that required spiritual cleansing, illness, moral transgressions, or preparation for important undertakings. Community purification ceremonies occurred at regular intervals throughout the year, their timing coordinated with seasonal transitions and agricultural activities that required divine blessing for successful completion. Entire communities would gather at local nymph sanctuaries for collective bathing rituals that renewed social bonds while ensuring divine favour for upcoming challenges. These community events often concluded with shared meals that incorporated foods blessed by contact with sacred waters, their consumption creating communion between participants while demonstrating gratitude for divine protection and provision. The role of nymph worship in marriage and fertility rites reflects ancient beliefs about the connection between natural fertility and human reproduction. Their ritual practices designed to ensure successful pregnancies, safe deliveries, and healthy children. Prospective brides regularly visited spring nymphs to request beauty, fertility, and marital harmony. Their offerings typically including jewellery, cosmetics, and personal ornaments that symbolised hopes for successful romantic relationships. These pre-marriage rituals often involved elaborate purification ceremonies that prepared young women for their new social roles while seeking divine protection during the vulnerable transition from maiden to wife. Pregnant women sought nymph assistance throughout their pregnancies, making regular offerings at local sanctuaries while requesting safe deliveries and healthy infants. The ritual practices associated with pregnancy included drinking sacred spring water believed to possess protective properties, wearing amulets inscribed with nymph names, and participating in special ceremonies designed to ensure divine favour during childbirth. Midwives often incorporated nymph invocations into their professional practices, their prayers and ritual procedures designed to invoke divine assistance during difficult deliveries. The integration of nymph worship with other religious cults created complex theological relationships that reflected the interconnected nature of ancient Greek religious thought and practice. The association between nymphs and Pan, the goat-footed god of shepherds and wild places, produced some of the most enduring partnerships in Greek religious tradition, their combined worship creating comprehensive divine protection for rural communities and pastoral occupations. Pan's sanctuaries regularly included provisions for nymph worship, while nymph sites often featured altars dedicated to the rustic god whose authority complemented their own natural powers. The ritual practices associated with pan-nymph worship emphasized the wild, untamed aspects of natural environments and the divine forces that governed wilderness areas beyond human control or cultivation. These ceremonies often involved ecstatic dancing, loud music, and dramatic performances that recreated mythological narratives about divine activities in natural settings. The participants wore animal skins and rustic costumes that emphasized their temporary abandonment of civilized behavior in favor of communion with primitive divine forces that preceded human cultural development. Hermes' connection to nymph worship developed through his roles as messenger god, protector of travelers, and guide for souls transitioning between different states of existence. His mother Maia's status as a Pleiad established ongoing connections between Hermes and stellar nymphs, while his function as divine herald created natural associations with the prophetic nymphs who transmitted divine messages to mortal supplicants. Hermes' sanctuaries often included facilities for nymph worship, particularly those nymphs associated with springs and crossroads, where the messenger god's protection was especially valued. The ritual integration of Hermes and nymph worship typically occurred at boundary locations, crossroads, mountain passes, harbour entrances, and other transitional spaces where divine protection was essential for safe passage. These ceremonies emphasized communication, travel safety, and successful completion of journeys, their participants seeking combined divine assistance from both the messenger god and the local nymphs whose territorial authority encompassed specific geographic regions. The offerings made at these integrated sites typically included items relevant to travel, sandals, walking sticks, food provisions, and small coins that served as payment for divine protection services. The Muses' association with certain categories of nymphs created important connections between artistic inspiration and natural beauty, their combined worship producing some of the most sophisticated religious and cultural activities in ancient Greek society. The nymphs of Mount Helicon served as attendants to the 9 Muses, their mountain domain providing ideal environments for creative activities, while their natural wisdom complemented the Muses' specialized knowledge of various artistic disciplines. The springs of Hippocrene and Aganippe, created by Pegasus and sacred to both Muses and nymphs, provided inspired water that enhanced creative abilities in those who drank from their sources. The festival celebrations that honoured both Muses and nymphs typically featured competitive performances in poetry, music and dance, their participants seeking divine inspiration while demonstrating their artistic achievements to appreciative audiences. These competitions served both religious and cultural functions, honouring divine patrons while providing opportunities for artistic development and public recognition. The winners received crowns woven from plants sacred to both Muses and nymphs, their victories attributed to divine favour rather than purely human skill. Mystery religions throughout the Greek world incorporated nymph figures into their secret initiation ceremonies and esoteric teachings, their roles reflecting beliefs about divine intermediaries who could facilitate communication between human initiates and transcendent divine powers. The Eleusinian mysteries included nymphs among the divine beings who participated in Demeter's search for Persephone, their knowledge of hidden springs and underground passages making them valuable allies in navigating the complex geography that connected upper and lower worlds. The initiates learned secret names and ritual procedures for invoking nymph assistance during their own spiritual journeys toward divine knowledge and mystical experience. The Dionysiac mysteries incorporated nymphs as participants in the gods' ecstatic celebrations and transformative rituals, their wild dancing and uninhibited behaviour serving as models for human initiates seeking liberation from conventional social constraints. The Maenads who followed Dionysus included both mortal women and nymphs, their combined activities creating religious experiences that transcended normal categories of divine and human behaviour. The mystery initiations often took place in natural settings, caves, groves, and mountainous regions, where nymph presence enhanced the otherworldly atmosphere necessary for successful mystical transformation. Local festivals throughout the Greek world featured nymph worship as central elements in community celebrations that combined religious devotion with social entertainment and economic activity. These festivals typically occurred at seasonal transitions that required divine blessing for successful completion, spring planting, summer harvests, autumn preparations for winter, and winter solstice celebrations that anticipated the return of longer days and renewed agricultural activity. The timing of these festivals reflected local environmental conditions and agricultural practices, their dates determined by observation of natural phenomena rather than fixed calendar systems. The economic impact of nymph festivals extended far beyond their immediate religious functions, as these celebrations attracted visitors from surrounding communities and provided opportunities for trade, craft sales, and professional entertainment that benefited local economies. Merchants would establish temporary stalls near sanctuary sites, selling religious objects, food, and craft goods to festival participants. Professional entertainers, musicians, dancers, storytellers, and athletes found employment during these celebrations, their performances adding to the festive atmosphere while demonstrating cultural achievements that honoured both divine recipients and human creativity. The transformation of nymph mythology from its ancient Greek origins through the Roman imperial period reveals a fascinating process of cultural adaptation that preserved essential characteristics while adapting to new political, social, and artistic contexts. Roman poets and artists encountered Greek nymph traditions through multiple channels, conquered territories with established cult sites, imported Greek slaves who carried religious knowledge, and literary works that circulated throughout the expanding Mediterranean world. The Romans demonstrated remarkable sophistication in their selective adoption and modification of these traditions, maintaining the fundamental nature connection aspects that made nymphs compelling while adapting their stories and worship practices to serve distinctly Roman cultural needs. Ovid's Metamorphoses represents perhaps the most influential Roman transformation of Greek nymph traditions, his narrative techniques and psychological insights creating character studies that would influence European literature for centuries. The poet's treatment of transformation stories like Daphne's flight from Apollo and Echo's punishment by Hera emphasized the emotional and psychological dimensions of divine mortal encounters while maintaining connections to traditional mythological frameworks. Ovid's sophisticated understanding of human psychology enabled him to present these ancient stories as explorations of universal themes, unrequited love, the abuse of power, and the tragic consequences of divine intervention in mortal affairs. The Roman adaptation of nymph imagery and decorative arts created new visual traditions that emphasized luxury, refinement, and the sophisticated appreciation of natural beauty that characterized elite Roman culture. Wealthy Romans commissioned elaborate frescoes depicting nymphs in idealized landscape settings, their artistic programs transforming private spaces into environments that evoked the peaceful, harmonious relationships between divine beings and pristine natural environments. These domestic decorations served multiple functions, demonstrating cultural sophistication, creating pleasant atmospheric conditions for social gatherings, and expressing philosophical attitudes about the relationship between civilization and nature. Roman garden design incorporated nymph imagery and water features that created physical environments where the boundaries between mythological narrative and lived experience became deliberately blurred. The elaborate nymphaea constructed in imperial gardens featured mechanical devices that animated water displays, while sculptural programs depicted nymphs engaged in various activities, pouring water from vessels, playing musical instruments, or dancing in circular formations. These engineered environments demonstrated Roman technical mastery while creating spaces where visitors could experience something approaching the divine presence that ancient sources associated with nymph encounters. The villa gardens of wealthy Romans throughout the empire featured artificial grottos, cascading fountains, and sculptural programs that recreated mythological landscapes within carefully controlled domestic settings. The Villa of Hadrian at Tivoli included multiple water features inspired by famous nymph sites throughout the Greek world, their designs combining accurate archaeological knowledge with creative architectural interpretation. These elaborate constructions enabled Roman elites to experience nymph mythology as environmental reality rather than mere literary narrative. Their daily lives incorporating elements of divine presence through sophisticated artistic and engineering achievements. The survival of nymph concepts through the collapse of classical civilization and their transformation within medieval European folklore demonstrates the remarkable adaptability of these mythological figures to changing cultural and religious contexts. As Christianity displaced traditional polytheistic religions throughout Europe, nymph-like beings persisted in popular folklore under various names and with modified characteristics that reflected new theological frameworks while preserving essential connections to natural environments and feminine divine power. Medieval European water spirits, forest maidens, and mountain fairies retained many characteristics inherited from classical nymph traditions. Their association with specific natural locations, their ability to help or harm mortals depending on treatment received, and their roles as intermediaries between human communities and the mysterious forces governing natural environments. The Germanic Nixies who inhabited rivers and lakes possessed healing powers and prophetic abilities reminiscent of ancient Naiads, while Celtic traditions preserved tree spirits whose life forces remained connected to specific forest locations in ways that closely paralleled classical Hamadryad mythology. The transformation of nymph-like beings within Christian contexts required careful theological negotiation, as church authorities sought to eliminate pagan religious practices while accommodating popular beliefs that proved impossible to suppress entirely. Medieval chroniclers and theologians developed complex explanations for the continued appearance of nymph-like beings in popular folklore. Some argued that these creatures represented demons attempting to deceive Christians, while others suggested they might be remnants of angelic beings who'd fallen from grace, but retained some beneficial powers. The integration of nymph-derived folklore into medieval Romance literature created new narrative traditions that preserved classical themes while adapting them to serve contemporary cultural and social needs. The forest maidens who appeared in Arthurian romances possessed many characteristics derived from ancient Dryad traditions. Their intimate knowledge of woodland environments, their ability to provide guidance and magical assistance to worthy knights, and their tendency to disappear when their natural domains were threatened by human encroachment or environmental destruction. The medieval development of fairy mythology throughout Europe incorporated numerous elements derived from classical nymph traditions, their characteristics and behaviours reflecting centuries of cultural transmission and adaptation. The water fairies of Celtic tradition retained the healing powers and prophetic abilities associated with ancient Naiads, while maintaining connections to specific springs, rivers and lakes that required protection from pollution and inappropriate human interference. These fairy traditions often incorporated Christian elements, alongside obviously pagan survivals, creating syncretic belief systems that enable traditional nature worship to persist within officially Christian societies. The Renaissance rediscovery of classical literature and art created unprecedented opportunities for scholars, artists, and writers to encounter authentic Greek and Roman nymph traditions through direct study of ancient sources rather than medieval adaptations and transformations. Humanist scholars working in Italian cities gained access to Greek manuscripts that had been preserved in Byzantine libraries, their translations making available detailed mythological narratives and religious practices that had been unknown in Western Europe for centuries. The artistic revolution that characterized Renaissance culture found in classical nymph imagery perfect subjects for exploring new techniques in painting, sculpture, and decorative arts. Botticelli's Birth of Venus transformed the traditional iconography of sea nymphs into one of the most recognizable images in Western art, his innovative techniques creating visual representations of divine beauty that captured both the ethereal nature of nymph mythology and the humanistic values that characterized Renaissance culture. The painting's combination of classical subject matter with contemporary artistic techniques established precedents for using mythological themes to explore philosophical and aesthetic questions about the nature of beauty, divinity, and human experience. The Renaissance development of perspective, anatomical accuracy, and naturalistic landscape representation provided artists with technical tools that enabled more convincing representations of the natural environments where nymphs were believed to dwell. Painters like Giorgione and Titian created landscape paintings that depicted nymphs in carefully observed natural settings, their works combining mythological narrative with scientific observation of botanical and geological details. These artistic achievements demonstrated how classical mythology could serve as a framework for exploring contemporary interests in natural philosophy and empirical observation. The revival of classical garden design during the Renaissance incorporated nymph imagery and water features that recreated ancient sanctuary environments while demonstrating contemporary engineering and artistic capabilities. The gardens of Italian villas featured elaborate fountain systems, artificial grottos, and sculptural programs that brought mythological narratives into physical reality through sophisticated artistic and technical achievements. The Villa d'Este at Tivoli included hundreds of fountains and water features that created comprehensive environments dedicated to nymph worship, their designs combining archaeological accuracy with creative interpretation that served both aesthetic and philosophical purposes. The influence of Renaissance nymph imagery spread throughout Europe as Italian artistic techniques and classical learning penetrated northern courts and cultural centres. French chateaux incorporated fountain systems and garden designs inspired by Italian models, while adapting classical imagery to serve local cultural preferences and political needs. The gardens at Fontainebleau featured nymph sculptures and water displays that celebrated both classical mythology and contemporary French royal power, their artistic programs demonstrating how ancient divine imagery could be adapted to serve modern political and cultural purposes. The development of opera during the late Renaissance and early Baroque periods created new opportunities for bringing nymph mythology to life through musical drama that combined visual spectacle with narrative complexity. Monteverdi's Orfeo included nymph characters whose musical roles enabled composers to explore the emotional and psychological dimensions of mythological narratives through sophisticated vocal techniques and instrumental accompaniment. These operatic treatments of classical themes created entirely new art forms that preserved ancient stories while adapting them to serve contemporary aesthetic and cultural needs. The neoclassical movement of the 17th and 18th centuries represented the most systematic attempt to revive classical nymph traditions within contemporary European culture, its practitioners seeking to recreate authentic ancient artistic and literary achievements while adapting them to serve modern philosophical and political purposes. The gardens of Versailles incorporated nymph imagery and water features on an unprecedented scale, their elaborate fountain systems and sculptural programs creating environments that demonstrated both royal power and sophisticated appreciation of classical culture. The Versailles Garden design team, led by André Le Notre, created water features that surpassed even ancient Roman achievements in their scale and technical sophistication. The Latona fountain depicted the mother of Apollo and Artemis surrounded by nymphs and other mythological figures. Its elaborate sculptural program and mechanical water displays creating spectacular effects that amazed visitors while demonstrating French artistic and engineering capabilities. The fountain's mythological narrative served political purposes by celebrating royal authority through classical imagery, while its technical achievements demonstrated the advanced state of French science and craftsmanship. The Grotto of Thetis at Versailles featured mechanical figures of nymphs that moved through the operation of hydraulic systems, their animated performances creating the illusion of divine presence within an artificial environment. These sophisticated automata represented the culmination of centuries of technical development in mechanical engineering and artistic design, their operation requiring teams of skilled technicians who maintained the complex systems that powered their movements. The grotto's combination of classical mythology with cutting-edge technology demonstrated how ancient stories could be adapted to serve contemporary cultural and political needs, while showcasing technical achievements that rivaled or surpassed ancient precedents. The English landscape garden movement of the 18th century developed alternative approaches to incorporating classical nymph imagery into designed environments, its practitioners favouring naturalistic settings that emphasised the harmony between human artistic intervention and existing natural conditions. Gardens like Stourhead featured carefully composed landscapes that included temples, grottos, and water features designed to evoke classical mythology while maintaining the appearance of natural environments that had developed without human interference. The scholarly revolution that accompanied the Enlightenment created new frameworks for understanding nymph mythology as historical and anthropological phenomena, rather than merely literary or artistic subjects. Scholars like J.G. Fraser and Max Muller developed comparative methodologies that analysed Greek nymph traditions alongside similar beliefs from other cultures, their research revealing common patterns in human religious development while identifying specific cultural factors that influenced the particular characteristics of different mythological systems. The development of archaeology as a scientific discipline during the 19th century provided unprecedented access to material evidence about ancient nymph worship. Excavations at sanctuary sites throughout Greece and the Mediterranean revealing detailed information about ritual practices, social contexts, and historical development that had been unknown to earlier scholars who relied primarily on literary sources. The discovery of thousands of votive offerings, dedicatory inscriptions, and architectural remains created comprehensive pictures of how ordinary ancient Greeks practiced nymph worship and integrated these divine beings into their daily lives. Archaeological evidence from sites like the Carishan Cave on Mount Parnassus revealed the continuity of nymph worship over many centuries. The accumulated deposits of offerings demonstrating how these religious practices adapted to changing political and cultural conditions while maintaining essential characteristics that connected worshippers to their natural environments. The material remains showed that nymph worship attracted participants from all social classes and included both local community members and visitors from distant regions who sought divine assistance for various personal and professional needs. Modern scholarly understanding of nymph mythology has evolved to recognize these divine beings as sophisticated representations of ancient Greek environmental consciousness, their complex characteristics and behaviors reflecting detailed observation of natural phenomena and deep understanding of ecological relationships. Contemporary environmental historians argue that nymph traditions preserved ancient knowledge about sustainable resource management, seasonal cycles, and the interconnected nature of different environmental systems that modern science has only recently begun to appreciate fully. The feminist scholarship of the late 20th and early 21st centuries has reinterpreted nymph mythology as evidence of powerful, feminine divine traditions that predated and persisted alongside the male-dominated Olympian pantheon. The characteristics and worship practices preserving alternative religious frameworks that emphasized cooperation with natural forces rather than domination over environmental resources. These scholarly approaches have revealed how nymph traditions provided ancient women with religious and cultural spaces where feminine divine power received recognition and reverence, their worship practices creating communities that celebrated female knowledge and authority. The ecological crisis facing the contemporary world has created renewed interest in ancient nymph traditions as sources of wisdom about sustainable relationships between human civilization and natural environments. Environmental activists and scholars have found in these mythological figures compelling examples of religious frameworks that recognize the sacred nature of natural resources while establishing ethical obligations for their protection and preservation. The nymph traditions that punished environmental destruction and rewarded respectful treatment of natural resources provide historical precedents for contemporary movements seeking to develop more sustainable approaches to resource management and environmental protection. The contemporary revival of nature-based spirituality has drawn extensively on nymph traditions as sources of inspiration and practical guidance, their characteristics and worship practices providing models for developing religious frameworks that honour the divine presence within natural environments. Modern practitioners have adapted ancient ritual techniques and mythological narratives to serve contemporary spiritual needs, while maintaining respect for the historical and cultural contexts that originally produced these religious traditions. The influence of nymph mythology on contemporary literature, art, and popular culture demonstrates the enduring appeal of these divine figures and their ability to serve as vehicles for exploring fundamental questions about the relationship between human civilization and the natural world. Fantasy literature has created new interpretations of nymph characters that preserve essential characteristics while adapting them to serve contemporary narrative needs and cultural concerns. These modern treatments often emphasize environmental themes and the consequences of technological development for natural ecosystems, their nymph characters serving as representatives of threatened natural environments that require protection from destructive human activities. The legacy of nymph mythology thus represents one of humanity's most enduring and adaptable religious and cultural traditions, their influence spanning more than 3 millennia and continuing to provide inspiration for contemporary efforts to understand and protect the natural world. From their origins in ancient Greek environmental consciousness through their transformation in Roman imperial culture, their survival in medieval European folklore, their revival during the Renaissance and neoclassical periods, and their reinterpretation in modern environmental and feminist scholarship, nymphs have demonstrated remarkable ability to serve diverse cultural needs while maintaining essential connections to the divine forces that govern natural environments. Their continued presence in contemporary culture suggests that these ancient divine beings will persist as long as humans seek to understand their relationship with the natural world and find meaning in the sacred dimensions of environmental experience.